Chapter 852. Ladies and gentlemen, this is the captain of this flight. After careful evaluation, I am sorry to inform you that this flight will be turning around and returning. Yukawa Aisuk was sitting sideways on his seat, with most of his legs stuck in the aisle. His body was slack and he was still trying to digest the changes that had happened before and after he fainted. He was not in a good state. The after effects of forcefully attaching his soul had yet to subside. His skull was buzzing, and occasionally there was a sharp tinnitus. Under such circumstances, he automatically filtered out most of the broadcast information of the flight, leaving only the most important word, return. His eyeballs moved, and he glanced sideways from the corner of his eye. The key factor that caused all this was right in front of him. Less than 3 meters away, the puppet controlled by the Pope, like Yukawa Aisuk, was sitting sideways on his seat, facing the aisle, with his elbows on his knees and his body slightly leaning forward. This posture had not changed for a long time. But compared to the moment when Yukawa Aisuk opened his eyes, this puppet that looked like a business elite seemed to have been sucked dry of blood and water. All that was left was a skinny silhouette, like a mummy. There was almost no breath coming in and out of its mouth and nose. With such damage to its body, it was already a miracle that it could maintain the most basic vitality. It would be difficult to do anything more than that. But to the Pope, this was not a problem at all. The Pope's consciousness was still here, calmly calculating and living within his means to maintain the puppet's breath. At the same time, everyone in the first-class cabin still had to rely on him to survive. It was precisely because this breath was too weak that everyone in the spacious cabin held their breaths. In most cases, they were like wooden statues. Yukawa Aisuk was the same. No one restrained him, but in this kind of atmosphere, the only things he could use were his eyes and thoughts. In the beginning, he only looked at his surroundings dizzily, passively accepting the drastic changes that happened after the nightmare. As time passed, his mushy brain began to slowly recover. Although this kind of recovery first brought about a sense of pain. Yukawa Aisuk saw the virtual workspace in front of the Pope's puppet, saw the mimicry of the spiritual sea, and saw the continuous appearance of chaotic ripples. Of course, he had heard and seen how the Pope taught Bai Xinyan how to operate the corresponding equipment. He almost didn't dare to think too deeply about the logic behind it. His mouth was full of bitterness. If possible, he hoped to delete all the orders and bargaining records related to the mimicry generator a few days ago, both in reality and in people's memories. However, this was only wishful thinking. Perhaps the relevant information was already placed on the Pope's desk, just waiting for an opportunity to act up. When I go back to Ban City, I must. Can I not go back? Speaking of which, it was absolutely impossible for Yukawa Aisuk to leave the Pope puppet side. As long as he recalled the scene where his mind felt as if he was trapped in a prison, his body involuntarily being controlled by others, fear and despair would follow him like a shadow, and there was no way to get rid of it. With the Pope by his side, Luonen wouldn't come again, right? Yukawa Aisuk adjusted his line of sight and looked at the porthole on the other side of the aisle. The first thing he saw was Kitano Suzuto's stout back. His head bodyguard's mind was no longer on his job. Instead, he was focused on observing the scene outside the porthole. Yukawa Aisuk could understand this. This was because at this moment, there was a strong light burning marks on the airship's porthole from time to time. At first, the marks were blurry and intermittent, but they became clearer and denser. That was, the true God has captured Luonan's position. I hope it's true this time. Bai Xinyan, who was in the back seat, spoke as she adjusted the parameters of the equipment. Her tone was very pragmatic, but because she was too pragmatic, she didn't seem to pay much attention to details. As she spoke, the deformed sound of the atmosphere penetrated the airship's armor and transmitted inside. It rumbled in everyone's ears. This was the power of a true God. Who knew if it was his emotions? Bai Xinyan smiled faintly. But there is one thing that can be confirmed. Luonen didn't successfully escape. His judgment was correct. The mummified Pope puppet didn't respond. Clearly, the Pope didn't want to waste his limited resources on idle chatter. On the other hand, Yukawa Aisuk's thoughts were still wandering. He subconsciously looked at his wristwatch. 22:42. It had been almost 20 minutes since he woke up. It was about the same amount of time since the most recent capture by a true God. During this period of time, almost everyone felt that Luonan had escaped. But now, the Pope was waiting silently. This perfectly displayed the difference in judgment between extraordinaries and normal people. But looking at it from another angle, Luo Nan, the bandit who could deprive others of their mental autonomy at any time, had endured under the eyes of a true god and the Pope for over 20 minutes. He had nearly exhausted the last drop of the Pope puppet's blood essence. He had almost succeeded. Unfortunately, he had failed on the verge of success. This was how Yukawa Isuk understood it. Why would he think of taking the initiative to provoke such a person? Every time he thought of this, Yukawa Isuk felt as if a handful of iron sand had been shoved into his chest, rubbing against it repeatedly. In any case, he should have let the true god and the Pope succeed this time. They should have killed that bastard. But in case they didn't, Yukawa Isuk subconsciously shivered. It was at this time that the cool bottle rested on the back of his hand. He almost subconsciously pushed it away, only to discover that something was wrong halfway through. It was a bottle of water from Bai Xinyan. Thank you. Yukawa Isuk subconsciously took it. He still remembered the warning and reminder Bai Xinyan gave him in that nightmare, before he completely lost control of his body. This was a favor. But correspondingly, there were still some doubts in his heart that had yet to be cleared up. Just from today's incident alone, did he really provoke that uninvited bandit? He did offend Luo Nan quite badly. Taking the airship far away from Ban City really gave Luo Nan the opportunity to make a move. But there was a faintly discernible sense of dislocation. What was going on? Yukawa Isuk shook his wrist, causing the bottle of mineral water to shake as well. It made a hua-hua sound. Perhaps he should do more research. For example, he should give Ban City a call. Most of the time, he was driven by his instincts. He did whatever he thought of. For a moment, he forgot about the situation in front of him. He found the communication number of his subordinate, Takamoto Shigeru, and was about to make a call. What can you see like this? You might as well drink it quickly. Bai Xinyan's voice interrupted at this time, disrupting Yukawa Isuk's plan. Ha! Yukawa Isuk was a bit stupefied. Why did her words not connect? Did she miss something in the middle? That was indeed the case. At this time, Kitano Sukito, who had been observing the scene outside the porthole, had already turned around. He saw his boss's expression and coughed lightly. Miss Bai is talking about the problem of Luo Nan's extraordinary power acting as a medium. Luo Nan is an expert in manipulating water. Kitano Sukito was giving a reminder. His technique was a bit crude, but it was also the result of the current tense situation. It was hard for people to care about meaningless etiquette and face. They were straightforward, with few decorations. Yukawa Isuk didn't quite understand, but he didn't bother to hide it. So, he is one of the few people in the world with the most profound attainments in the condensation ring. Perhaps he is second only to Her Majesty Empress Wu. The condensation ring is currently the most efficient configuration technology known to probe into the water molecule level. Bai Xinyan pointed at the mimicry image of the mental sea. She also pointed at the corner of the image. She made some notes based on the changes in the image. Right now, we can basically confirm that every time he appears, the water molecules in the atmosphere are abnormally active. The bubbles in the bottle of water were quite obvious just now. I was wondering if this was due to some sort of resonance effect. The corner of Yukawa Isuk's eye twitched a few times. The bottle of water in his hand suddenly turned into a red-hot soldering iron, sticking to the flesh of his palm. It was not easy to hold it, nor was it easy to throw it away. After a few seconds, Yukawa Isuk finally made up his mind. He gritted his teeth and said, "Then go ask him." Bai Xinyan smiled. She gestured to Yukawa Isuk to take a good look at the current state of the Pope's puppet. The latter's stiff, mummified appearance was the best reason. Yukawa Isuk took a deep breath. Ha! It was strange. After the previous round of torment, the atmosphere that made people dare not even breathe had become lively. Although the Pope's consciousness was probably still watching everything coldly, or maybe he was silently keeping score, at least for now, he didn't have the intention to blame anyone, let alone the strength to do so. Haha. Whether it was a brilliant realization or a broken pot, Yukawa Isuk's breathing had indeed become a lot livelier. The corner of his mouth twitched. He threw the bottle of water in his hand back to Bai Xinyan. "You came to this conclusion after observing for such a long time?" Bai Xinyan caught it firmly. She unscrewed the cap and took a big gulp without any misgivings. She exhaled a long breath, looking like she was drinking fine wine. I didn't need to observe to come to this conclusion. Since you made a move against him, did you not read Persona? Persona. Oh, I did. Yukawa Isuk still had an impression of it. The target of this intelligence analysis, named Persona Mask, was Luo Nan. The information had been published more than half a year ago. At that time, Luo Nan was using the cage theory to sweep away the traditional soul theory of the inner world. It was quite popular for a time, but the analysis itself was a bit secretive. The follow-up was not followed up in time, so it slowly lost its popularity. The version in Yukawa Isuk's hands also included the comprehensive analysis of various sources by his family's intelligence personnel. The research was more comprehensive than the one on the market. But what did Bai Xinyan mean by mentioning it? Bai Xinyan took a big gulp of mineral water. Her eyes wandered as if she was tipsy. Answer. According to the logic of the Persona Mask, Professor Luo has 3 basic faces: rationality, strength, and weakness. Which face are we facing now? It's rationality. It wasn't Yukawa Isuk who answered. It was the Pope's puppet that let out a buzzing sound. Chapter 853. Yukawa Isuk confirmed that it was the papal puppet who spoke. The puppet's lips moved slightly as it made a sound. But other than that, there was no other change. The dim pupils were still pointing at the spiritual sea mimicry map. Your Majesty also watches Persona? On the other side, Bai Xinyan quickly changed the topic of conversation. Her reaction was lively and quick, a stark contrast from the honest operator a few minutes ago. In fact, ever since Bai Xinyan took the initiative to speak and handed over the bottle of water, her attitude had changed subtly. This made Yukawa Isuk wonder if he was just a prelude to the previous round of conversation. While he was suspicious, Yukawa Isuk was actually listening attentively to hear how the Pope would respond. But before he could do that, another wave of low vibrations entered the cabin. The intensity of the sound wave was average, but it just so happened to resonate with the structure of the airship. For a moment, the cabin windows and seats were buzzing, and the vibrations numbed everyone's limbs and lumbar spine. Obviously, it was not only the first-class cabin that was experiencing this. Yukawa Isuk could already hear the screams from the other cabins. To be honest, Yukawa Isuk was also a little panicked. At this moment, the papal puppet's whisper sounded again in the buzzing vibration. Shrink. Yukawa Isuk could no longer understand the professional jargon behind it. Bai Xinyan reacted quickly and started a new round of operation on the spiritual sea mimicry map. The scale of the spiritual sea mimicry map seemed to be increasing, showing more details. Of course, probably only the Pope and Bai Xinyan could understand it. What Yukawa Isuk saw was a simple electrocardiogram on the interface, sometimes on the left, sometimes on the right, moving up and down. But forgive his poor eyesight, even if the details in some areas had increased, there was no obvious change on the whole. Only a professional would be able to figure out the trick from this. It doesn't seem to be suitable. Bai Xinyan's voice sounded again, as if she was regretting it. But in the current situation, it sounded awkward no matter how one listened to it. The papal puppet did not make any obvious movements. Beneath its half-closed eyelids, it still vaguely gazed at the mimicry image of the spiritual sea. Just when everyone thought that this scene would continue, a low mosquito-like voice rang out. What do you think? It's just not very suitable. The Pope puppet did not waste any more energy to speak, only glancing over with its gloomy and lightless eyes. His cold gaze got rid of the casual air that had just appeared in Bai Xinyan's body. She instinctively bowed, and the smile on her lips became much more restrained. Please forgive me, Your Highness. I didn't speak clearly. Actually, it was Your Highness who helped me to roughly understand the design of the mimicry image of the spiritual sea. That's how I came up with this idea. If there's anything I don't understand, I hope Your Highness can enlighten me. After talking for a while, Bai Xinyan went straight to the point. The parameters set up by Your Majesty are based on the airship tourists. It's the structure of the spiritual sea built by the airship tourists. This structure was more in line with the main background from last time in Ban City. The results that appeared were more comparable. But the problem was that His Majesty and the Lord True God had descended. Junior Luo Nan didn't dare to linger. He fled far away and only played around in the periphery. The structure built by the hundreds of passengers on the yacht was clearly insufficient in terms of coverage. Therefore, I boldly guess that your highness should take the initiative to graft this layer of structure with the power projected by the Lord True God. He forcefully spread it out and expanded its coverage, allowing Luo Nan's methods to leave traces on it as much as possible. The Pope puppet did not have any obvious reaction to Bai Xinyan's narration. Next to her, Yukawa Aishuk listened very seriously. Of course, he didn't quite understand, but his imagination was pretty good. The scene of the Pope spreading out a thick pancake and sending it to the true God's hands to spin in circles or cast a net to catch fish appeared in his mind. That was probably what it meant. The Pope didn't object. That meant he acknowledged it. Wait a minute. Weren't Yukawa Aishuk and the others also passengers on the airship? In other words, they were also part of the ingredients for this pancake? Bai Xinyan seemed to have heard his thoughts as he let his imagination run wild. She tilted her head and smiled. Yes. The distance between us and Professor Luo is much closer than we imagined. It's like an oil slick on the surface of the water, or a fly sticker. Yukawa Aishuk's expression was a bit stiff. He turned to look at his head bodyguard. Kitano Sakuto stood upright like a wooden stake. Yukawa Aishuk could get his answer from this guy's reaction. The problem right now is that Luo Nan's methods are a bit unreasonable. It's beyond my expectations. The Pope puppet's cracked and bloodless lips opened and closed slightly. Its voice was weak and vague, but its meaning was clear. He can hide, and he can counterattack. The voice stopped for a few seconds. It seemed as if it was unwilling to mention it. It seemed as if it was pondering over its words. But in the end, it still determined Luo Nan's behavior. It's very pure. Bai Xinyan didn't seem to understand. She asked, "What do you mean by pure?" The papal puppet wanted to continue speaking, but what flowed from its mouth this time was dark red froth of blood. Bai Xinyan let out an "ah." She still spoke in a regretful tone. This body has finally reached its limit. Your Majesty, is there any other way to persevere? As soon as these words left her mouth, Bai Xinyan immediately received a dozen gazes from all around her, especially the bodyguards who were trying their best to hide in the shadows. They looked like they were about to collapse. The problem was that their wills were never taken into consideration. That included Bai Xinyan. In the next second, an indescribable shadow filled the eyes of everyone in the first-class cabin. Yukawa Aishuk felt as if he had taken a step into the shade of the branches and leaves under the sun. To be more precise, he himself was part of the shade. He faced the blazing sun while weaving the shadows. Everyone in the first-class cabin was probably doing this. This shade was not meant for them to enjoy. The Pope puppet was completely motionless. Having used up its last drop of blood essence, it had completely turned into a dried corpse. Meanwhile, the Pope's will, which had borrowed the existence of its corpse, conveniently entered the tree's shade. Using an exquisite guiding power, it intersected the branches and leaves in all directions, ultimately forming a tree nest that was the structure of a spiritual vessel. A wonderful feedback came. Yukawa Aishuk suddenly realized that he had a bit of the ability to communicate in the mental realm. This ability was undoubtedly given to him by the Pope. It was also decided by his current state. In the end, the Pope switched to the mode of mental projection. This time, there was no one to act as a power bank. It was probably because the same method was not suitable for a third time. He could only settle for the next best thing. Thus, everyone present, including Yukawa Aishuk, became the framework of the so-called tree nest. As for what the tree nest was, not many people understood. It was because it was a construct on the mental plane. According to Yukawa Aishuk's understanding, the Pope used the magnetic fields of their lives to build a temporary nest, or safe haven. This provided the conditions for a weak consciousness to stay in space. No one knew the specifics of the situation. Only one thing was certain. The Pope's consciousness could directly appear in their minds, turning into images and sounds to achieve communication. This is a mental technique, but it is not used on the emotional level of Yukawa. Instead, it comes and goes, directly affecting the space-time structure. The Pope seamlessly continued his previous evaluation and analysis of Luo Nan. This was an explanation for purity. Yukawa Aishuk should not have understood this. But in this tree nest shadow state, he muddle-headedly understood a lot of conceptual knowledge. He also possessed the ability to make preliminary analysis. It was as if there was a built-in AI operating. Because it was purity, it broke away from the level of the Pope's design. Although it would still have an impact, this impact was no different from the impact of nature's wind, rain, thunder, and lightning. It was practically impossible to capture Luo Nan's special interference mode through the sea of consciousness mimicry. In other words, the Pope's plan was ruined. Yukawa Aishuk seemed to have split into two sides. One side had the normal thoughts of a mortal, and the other floated on the supernatural plane. He did not even have the time to fear before he was pushed forward by the surging pressure of information. He could only do his best to adapt to his current state. The Pope was still communicating with Bai Xinyan. It's still useful. At least we know the upper limit of Luo Nan's level. He's much stronger than expected. And we also know that Luo Nan's forte is not in making a fuss over people's emotions. Instead, he bypassed the path of controlling other people's fates and entered the domain of pure configuration design. Especially space-time configurations. It's still related to the situation in Ban City. Without the restrictions of the material plane, the Pope was a lot more talkative. And it was the exquisiteness of his words that made Yukawa Aishuk think, I wonder how Luo Nan feels when he's being studied by an extraordinary? Amidst his thoughts, Yukawa Aishuk suddenly felt that the sunlight behind him had suddenly become extremely hot. At the same time, his fleshly body also captured a new wave of lightning and thunder. This made him understand. Becoming a tree nest, embedding itself into the mental framework, meant that it was closer to the battlefield? In a trance, a part of Yukawa Aishuk's consciousness was thrown into the depths of the hazy void. He touched upon the ever-changing battlefield of the true God and Luo Nan. Even though his brain was now implanted with the AI, he was still unable to experience the exquisite details. He could only feel some vague symbolic feelings. Luo Nan really did seem to be embedded in the depths of the void. It was like the hidden chain lock of a precision machine. When it twisted and turned, there would be some deformation inside. But on the outside, it was always in a stable and smooth state. It satisfied the psychological instinct of people to pursue order. Not only did it conform to people's psychology, but it also conformed to the laws and principles of the world. Chapter 854. Yukawa Aishuk watched with rapt attention. For him, the battlefield outside of the intercontinental airship was still flashing with blurry images. But after seeing it many times, a certain logic naturally formed. As time passed, his condition improved significantly. In his days, it was as if an invisible thread was pulling him to a higher place, allowing him to see more clearly and more thoroughly. Everything happened in the shadows. It was silent and undetectable. It was as if a god had blessed him. His train of thought became exceptionally clear. He was no longer constrained by the present situation. He made some expansions and extensions. He felt that a true god's method of pursuit was like a dragnet. Luo Nan was like a fish in the net. The dragnet itself was very large. There was a certain amount of space for movement. The mesh was not small either. There was a possibility of escape at any time. Now that the airship was forced to turn back, it was advantageous for the true god and the Pope. After all, the closer they were to Ban City, the greater the control the true god had over the dragnet. They could shrink the mesh and give Luo Nan more pressure. Unexpectedly, you have the potential in this area. The Pope transmitted telepathically. The direction was very clear. It was directed at Yukawa Aishuk. Was he evaluating him? Yukawa Aishuk was startled and chilled. How did the Pope know what he was thinking? Well, it must be because of this damn tree nest. For an extraordinary like the Pope, it was not a big deal for him to use methods like mind reading. But this feeling was more or less the same as Luo Nan's invasion. Oh, there was still a difference. Luo Nan was a great thief. He suddenly came. It was unknown what path he took. By the time he came to his senses, he had already fallen into the trap. He was muddle-headed and tied up. The Pope, on the other hand, had an aura of open warfare. It was as if it was a matter of course. I came in and stayed. You do whatever you want. I just stared at you. The degree of perverseness was even. Cough. Yukawa Aishuk cut off his thoughts. He did not dare to think too deeply about it. He forced himself to think about positive issues. For example, that evaluation. In the field of ability users, the Pope's words were more or less the same. Could it be that he really had talent in this area for this person to think highly of him? He had seen too much and thought too much. He was getting a bit carried away. Yukawa Aishuk subconsciously pondered. If he could get through this, perhaps he could focus on developing this aspect? While he was lost in his own thoughts, the Pope gave his evaluation, and then conversed with by Xinyan. He's very restrained. He spins at a low speed and glides in neutral. The Pope also used an analogy to describe Luo Nan's current state. It was easy for everyone to understand. Bai Xinyan said, perhaps he can only maintain such a low consumption state in the void interlayer, and also avoid direct interference with the true God's power. It's a reasonable judgment, but it's a little perfunctory. It's all thanks to your Majesty's wisdom that I was able to think of these things. However, we are just small fries. It's fine for a short period of time, but if we continue to act as the carrier of the tree nest, and bear the pressure of Swanee's calculations, I'm afraid we'll soon be unable to do as we wish. So far so good. The Pope's reply was so cold that it made people's hearts sink. However, no one dared to contradict her. Bai Xinyan's actions were already extremely out of line. Yukawa Aishin's heart was stupefied. So that's how it is. But that's the only logical explanation. Who in this world was born with knowledge? Even if there was such a thing, it would most likely belong to the young man outside the airship who had dealings with the true God and the Pope. The pain came from the comparison. The clearer his heart was, the more bitter the comparison was. At this moment, Yukawa Aishin felt as if there was a poisonous spider crawling in his heart. Its limbs scratched the tip of his heart, and there was a web of silk entanglement. There were no external injuries, but he always felt as if poison was slowly seeping in. It was extremely stifling. But in this current state, he could not help it. Very quickly, his attention was drawn away by the miraculous changes in the hazy void. Even though Yukawa Aishin knew that this was only a temporary ability given to him by the Pope, he still enjoyed the process of being able to observe, analyze, and make judgments. After all, this was an extraordinary ability that he had always yearned for. Its level was high, its profoundness was profound, and it far exceeded his imagination. He greedily perceived the mysteries within the structure of space and time, especially from the perspective of the true God and the Pope. After he shared the Pope's burden and received the blessing, it became easier to cut in and understand. Well, he still seemed to understand, but he wasn't. Especially when his rationality was still a mess, but he always felt that there was a side of his heart that was crystal clear and crystal clear. I still have talent, it's just that I haven't developed it yet. Yukawa Aishin kept encouraging himself. As the head of a large family, he did not lack confidence. It was just that he was forced into a field that he was not good at, and it was inevitable that he would feel inferior. Now, this half-yin half-yang, suddenly bright and suddenly dark state gave him a reason to convince himself. It also allowed his thoughts to maintain a good state on a logical level. He was thinking again. Judging from the airship's return, and the Pope's constant switching of mental states, the two of them probably did not expect the current situation at the beginning. Transcendents were indeed not gods. They also had their limits, be it in terms of strength or calculation. In the past, he had only deduced it in theory, but now he was seeing it with his own eyes. And because of this, he could never become a believer. Deep in his heart, a subtle thought spun. Yukawa Aishin suddenly felt dizzy and nauseous. But his mind was exceptionally clear, and the discomfort in every part of his body was transmitted to him, layer by layer. In an instant, too much information accumulated, and his brain felt like it was on fire. With a muffled groan, Yukawa Aishin curled up into a ball. In the real world, Bai Xinyan handed him another bottle of water and patted his back kindly. Keep your mind blank. All this information is giving you too much pressure, it's not good for your body to think too much. Huff huff. Yukawa Aishin could only gasp for air. How could he have the strength to respond? You still need to work on your foundation. The Pope's consciousness came again, like a chilly wind blowing into the depths of his mind. It's rare to have such talent. Go back to Osaka and train in the Amaterasu Heavenly Court for a while. Yukawa Aishin's mind was confused, and his heart was filled with joy, worry, and fear. For a moment, he did not know how to respond. In fact, he felt that even if he did not say it, The Pope should be able to dig out these emotions from the bottom of his heart. What he needed was just a superficial statement. Just as he started, the shadow of the tree nest suddenly shook. No, it should be a sudden impact on the physical plane, enveloping everyone and every plane. Everything happened so suddenly that Yukawa Aishuk didn't know what angle he should observe from, but in the end, he didn't have to choose. Because at this moment, whether it was on the spiritual plane that the Pope was guiding or on the physical plane that his mortal body could perceive, there was a sudden rush of water vapor and a sudden coolness. Bai Xinyan made a footnote for this phenomenon. Finally, we hit it. Chapter 855. The intercontinental airship had completed its turn. It was as if it had crashed into a cumulonimbus cloud. Plentiful water vapor and high-altitude astral winds intertwined, instantly blurring the portholes on both sides. Then, a nearly parallel waterline was drawn above the airship. In the dark environment, the cloud was like a demon. It danced outside the porthole and was cut into pieces by the waterline. Yukawa Aishuk looked at the changes in the environment between light and dark. He was suddenly inspired. In his daze, he forgot about the severe discomfort in his body. At this moment, he seemed to see the aftermath of the collision between Luo Nan and a true god in the void. The collision was so intense that even the sealed cabin seemed to be leaking. Yes, it was the feeling of water vapor blowing on one's face. Yukawa Aishuk saw Kitano Suzuto subconsciously wipe his face. Kitano Suzuto's back was facing the direction of the airship. The Pope communicated with Bai Xinyan in the shadow of the tree nest. This was his evaluation of the sudden phenomenon. Nothing solid. You've locked onto it? No. The progression is so beautiful. This was the first time in Yukawa Aishuk's memory that the Pope had an emotional sigh. For a while, there was no response from within the tree nest until the airship shook again. The second wave, the third wave. The shaking of the airship was closely related to the structural changes in the depths of the cloud. Due to the distribution of computational pressure, the relevant information flowed and circulated in the shadow of the tree nest, peeling off layer by layer. Of course, some people knew less and some people knew more. Yukawa Aishuk could see it relatively clearly. He knew that the water vapor cloud was the product of the collision between Luo Nan and the true god. Luo Nan used the condensation ring as the basic interference core. It was destined to rely on an abundant water vapor environment. The true god carried out a strong suppression. The collision of the two sides on the material plane caused the water vapor in the sky to condense and explode abnormally, creating this cloud phenomenon. Because of this, the cool feeling of the water vapor was able to penetrate the obstruction of the airship's outer shell and directly affect the people's bodies and minds. It's mixed with fragments from the collapse of the void. If the intensity is increased, this airship will be cut to pieces. But then it will be completely at the extraordinary level. Yukawa Aishuk's thought seemed to have left his identity as a passenger and jumped out of his own dimension. With incredible focus, he observed and evaluated the increasingly intense battle. Luo Nan and the true god were currently locked in front of the airship, in contrast to the aimless pursuit of Luo Nan. Because of this, the scale of the cumulonimbus cloud that the airship crashed into continued to expand. The airship's strategy was to increase its altitude in an attempt to avoid danger, but the effect was really suspicious. Dark clouds continued to surge in the surroundings. Between the layers of clouds, lightning and fire swam about, flickering and extinguishing. Some of them even struck straight at him. Although they were all blocked by the insulating armor on the outer layer, the thunderous roar still crushed in. Each strike was louder than the last, each strike stronger than the last. The cries and screams from the lower cabins never ceased. This stalemate was really absurd. According to Yukawa Aishuk's observations, the true god should have locked onto Luo Nan's relative position. It was relative to Luo Nan's current functional region within the space-time structure. Right now, he was still bombarding Luo Nan's outer shell. He had yet to truly explore the core. Luo Nan was still hidden deep within the void, and the true god was constantly trying to squeeze him out from the space-time structure. For this reason, Luo Nan adopted an unprecedented proactive attitude. He forcefully interfered with the plentiful water vapor of the material plane, forming some sort of defense system. He used the mutual interference between the mental and the material plane to continuously dissolve the true god's attacks. This was what the Pope meant by progressive levels. Thoughts that even he himself found hard to understand revolved wildly in Yukawa Isuk's mind. It was like a drill, drilling deeper and deeper, getting closer and closer to that mysterious and unfathomable level. But unwittingly, he drilled through the limits of his body. In the end, he collapsed. His vision went black, and his mind suddenly went blank. Yukawa Isuk's figure fell forward, falling out of his seat. Fortunately, Kitano Sweto reacted in time. He extended his arm to block, preventing Yukawa Isuk from hitting the ground. But at this moment, the shadow of the tree nest was affected by Yukawa Isuk's mental disruption. It lost an important support, and the structure of the mental plane suddenly shook. Yukawa Isuk fainted in time, so he wasn't affected. As for the others, whether it was by Xinyan, Kitano Sweto, or the group of bodyguards, they were all affected to varying degrees. For a moment, the sky was dark, and there was strong light and high temperature that penetrated the shadow barrier. It was much more refreshing than being exposed to the sun. Several people let out muffled groans. Most likely, they suffered damage on the mental plane. The Pope's telepathic thoughts paused for a moment, and then the structure of the tree nest returned to normal. But at this moment, the mummified puppet suddenly fell to the ground. Bai Xinyan, who was in front of him, didn't reach out. She watched as the corpse fell to the ground with a muffled thud. Bai Xinyan's eyebrows twitched. She could confirm that the Pope had left the last bit of blood essence in the puppet's body to save the situation. He had burned it in this accident. She sighed. Sometimes, having the ability is a problem. Yeah. The Pope's telepathic thoughts were quite steady. He didn't have any intention of venting his anger, and he couldn't find a reason to be angry. Anyone with eyes could see that Yukawa Isuk's fall was almost certain. His thoughts were unexpectedly compatible in the field of space-time configuration, which caused the analytical pressure to be too great, and his physical fitness couldn't keep up. It was like using a primitive single-cylinder engine to drag a heavy truck, and still having to run at the speed of an F1. It was only a matter of time before the tank exploded. Since the Pope had used the structure of the tree nest to divert some of the pressure to others, and obtained the effect of reducing the pressure, he had to bear the corresponding risk. Bai Xinyan timely said, "Misfortune may be a blessing in disguise. I still have to congratulate Your Majesty on obtaining another beautiful and talented person." In the shadow of the tree nest, she could no longer feel the Pope's emotional response. It was as if he had sunk into emptiness and swallowed the corresponding information. But Bai Xinyan still had a feeling that something had been hooked by an invisible claw, and disappeared without a trace. Was it the Pope's firm judgment and confidence? Bai Xinyan frowned slightly. Half a second later, she suddenly stood up, and directly stepped over the mummified corpse of the Pope's puppet, and walked to the front of the first-class cabin. Kitano Sweto, who was in front, was stunned for a moment. He quickly used the opportunity to help his boss settle down to make a path. The Pope was still there, but the puppet still had some kind of symbolic meaning. When the puppet fell, it was as if a switch had been flipped, and an invisible layer of restraint was released from the body of the people. Bai Xinyan was only the first to verify it. The advantage of intercontinental airships over traditional passenger planes was that they were stable, safe, and relatively spacious. The first-class cabin was also first-class in terms of space utilization and enjoyment. There was even a small observation deck at the front, which was the best view of the entire airship, second only to the cockpit. But it was night time, and there had been many unforeseen events. The observation deck was wrapped in thick armor, and it was tightly sealed. Of course, this was not a problem for Bai Xinyan. After a few steps, the outer armor was slowly opened under her permission. When Bai Xinyan walked up to the observation deck, footsteps sounded behind her. It was Kitano Sweto. This head bodyguard of the Yuchuan family, even if it was just a physical body, was still a B-level powerhouse. In the structure of the tree nest, he was shouldering a lot of the pressure. Correspondingly, he also had his own thoughts about the situation, but he was just suppressing them. Bai Xinyan did not care what he was thinking. She looked at the dark clouds in front of her. Just then, another lightning bolt struck down from the sky, illuminating the outline of the clouds that were like the precipice of an abyss. The incoming clouds were like beasts and demons that lived among them. They hit the outer shell of the airship, and instantly shattered, then reassembled into other demonic shapes. After a second, Kitano Sweto, who was beside her, let out a low gasp. "Over there! What affected his breathing was not the cloud phantom that was pouncing at him, but an area further away. Between the flowing and changing clouds, there was an obvious difference. How to put it? If the outer layer of scattered clouds was peeled off, the central area was obviously also made of clouds, but the outline was sharp, orderly, and full of artificial sturdiness. Another lightning bolt struck down, directly piercing through the outer layer of clouds and bombarding that area. In the eyes of Bai Xinyan and Kitano Sweto, faint ripples appeared in the void. The lightning bolt warped and curled around the periphery of that area until it dissipated. Some of the dissipated lightning eventually broke through, collapsing a corner of the cloud structure. But soon, lightning surged to fill the gap. It was still a square block, but it felt even more sturdy. It was simply a defensive fortification built by relying on the cloud mountain. Or perhaps it was a towering mountain pass in front of the airship. No matter how the outer layer of clouds changed, no matter how powerful the lightning bolt struck, that area continued to be fortified. It gave people the feeling that if the airship were to collide with it, it would most likely be smashed into smithereens. A fortress of the Ring of Blood will? Bai Xinyan glanced over. This one sentence proved that Kitano Sweto had done his homework on Luo Nan. Of course, this was due to the fact that this toy was famous. It only existed in the circle of ability users in Xia City. It was a marvelous configuration design that spread through all sorts of channels. If it were projected onto the plane of reality, it would probably look like this. Bai Xinyan did not object. She just muttered, "The Ring of Blood will fortress?" The two of them spoke one after another, but before they could really communicate, a strong light suddenly burst out of the gloomy clouds. In the blink of an eye, it surpassed the level of lightning. The light was as dazzling as the sun, but it did not follow the trajectory of the sky at all. Instead, it fell straight towards the pass ahead. At this moment, the cumulonimbus clouds with abundant water vapor seemed to have been ignited. Chapter 856. Under the strong light, Bai Xinyan and Kitano Sweto squinted their eyes. The cloudy void in front of them had turned into a giant steamer. Everything was blurred and distorted in the steam, including the pass in front of them. However, the pass area was somewhat out of place with the overall environment. It had a certain degree of resistance, so when the falling sun wheels smashed down, there was a slight deflection. Distortion against distortion. Time and space were stagnant for a while. The momentum of the impact slowed down, and the scene in front of them became more and more blurry. Illusion? Real world? Kitano Sweto was a typical physical type of person. As long as any supernatural situation did not really affect him, he would be suspicious. He still did not hear Bai Xinyan's answer. As for the Pope, the moment Kitano Sweto's mind hooked with the madam, he suddenly felt dizzy. His feet seemed to have lost their support, and he felt a strong sense of falling. As a physical type of person, maintaining balance was a natural ability. Kitano Sweto subconsciously exerted strength in his waist and abdomen, but the feedback from his body told him that he was still standing there, very straight and stable. What was really out of balance and falling was his soul. A blinding light shone in. This time, it was hard to tell whether it was from the real world or the spiritual stimulation. It intertwined with the shadow structure of the tree nest, forming a sacrificial furnace that ignited all the soul power involved. At this moment, the tree nest structure extracted the soul power of Kitano Sweto and the others, and used it for other purposes. It was most likely to coordinate with the attack of the falling sun wheel. This was not surprising at all. Kitano Sweto was not a fledgling. The Pope used the tree nest to include all of them in the spiritual structure, so there must be a deeper consideration. Compared to the usual actions of the Amaterasu cult, what they did today was considered a relatively peaceful one. After all, he was a level B physical type. Although his soul power was not his forte, his foundation was solid, and he was full of vitality. This wave of absorption would not cause serious damage. At the moment, he was only short of breath and dizzy, but his mind was still clear. While he was checking his own condition, the violent vibration transmitted from the void in front of him ran over the tempered glass of the viewing platform and pressed on his chest. The vibration was transmitted from his chest to his brain, so much so that his lips and teeth were numb. He instinctively raised his head, but his vision was dark. It had nothing to do with the blood supply to the head. Instead, in the distant burning cloud, the falling sun happened to have an extremely obvious contraction, and its light was clearly dimming. As the light and darkness changed, the distortion of the void increased dramatically. Kitano Sujito could no longer see anything with his naked eyes. All he could see was the accumulation of complex colors. However, between the real thing and the illusion, there was a vague network that extended in the vast space. Kitano Sujito captured the most intuitive outline. It was like a towering tree, with branches on top and roots on the bottom. Half of it was visible, and the other half penetrated into the endless void. It also directly interfered with the structure of time and space. The sun wheel, that ruled over the changes in brightness and darkness in the sky, was also inextricably linked to the outline of the veins. Great divine treasure of the Fusang divine tree. Any ability user in Ban City could guess this answer based on their instincts. But what was special about Hoshino Sujito was that his spirit and perception could follow the veins of the roots in the void and explore into a level that was unimaginable in the past, allowing him to see the most intuitive details. Am I also talented in the structure of time and space? As the absurd thought popped up in his head, Hoshino Sujito also saw the brilliant sun wheel, held up by the branches of the giant tree, like a tomahawk in the hands of a giant god. After the first attack failed, it slightly retracted and then smashed down again. Crack! The pure explosion on the spiritual level crushed Hoshino Sujito's mind. His mind was tightly bound to the extraordinary image of the sun wheel and the giant tree. When it collided with the pass in the clouds, he felt most of the details inside and also had to bear the surging impact from every detail. With a muffled groan, Hoshino Sujito's brain felt like it was forcibly split open and filled with hot magma. The pain was far greater than the damage from having his soul power sucked away. Even with his strong physique, he couldn't resist it. He staggered back a few steps until he hit the doorframe at the entrance of the observation deck. His legs were so weak that he couldn't support his body, and he slowly fell to the ground. The self-protection mechanism was finally activated. The sun wheel and the giant tree all turned into meaningless smoke. Even the corresponding memories were blurred. He just followed the inertia in front of him. He opened his eyes wide and watched the distortion around the pass in the clouds, pushed to the extreme, and the abnormal contraction of the sun wheel also pressed to the extreme. When things reached an extreme, they would move in the opposite direction. In just 1,000th of a second, an unprecedented strong light burst out. Hoshino Sujito closed his eyes, but the strong light still penetrated his eyelids and reflected a translucent blood-red color. 2 seconds later, the strong light faded and Hoshino Sujito dared to open his eyes. Even after the most dazzling wave of light had passed, half of the sky was still as bright as day. The dark night had been torn to pieces and there was almost no trace of it. He saw that under the bombardment of the sun wheel, most of the structure of the pass, built next to the clouds, had evaporated. There was a large hole in the center with a radius of at least 1 kilometer. In this void environment, the thick clouds that were like towering mountains had become irregular piles that connected the front and the back. Even the other areas that didn't bear the impact of the sun wheel were already riddled with holes. It seemed that if there was another strong wind, it would vanish into thin air. The intercontinental airship moved forward under the bright light. There was almost no cumulonimbus around it. It was like a normal flight. This is really... Hoshino Sujito was confused. Everything that had just happened was beyond his cognitive limit. The self-protection mechanism was still working. All he knew was that the situation had suddenly been pushed to the most intense level. In the blink of an eye, there were only ruins left. At this time, he saw Bai Xinyan, who was still standing in front of him. The most intense scene had passed. Everyone was finally able to focus on something that they had neglected before. This mysterious woman stood perfectly straight from the waist down, but her upper body was leaning forward. She stretched out her arms against the tempered glass wall. Her body trembled as she breathed. It was clear that the other side wasn't having a good time either. Hoshino Sujito opened his mouth, wanting to ask a few questions, but the smell of fresh blood rushed up his throat. His mouth and nose were already wet. The relatively weak capillary network had nearly burst clean. He choked and coughed. Blood sprayed everywhere. He was in a sorry state. Bai Xinyan must have heard the cough. She exerted some strength in her arms and turned around to look. Her expression was calm, but her face was pale to the point of being transparent. Hoshino Sujito coughed out the blood clot in his throat with great difficulty. He asked in a hoarse voice, "Is he dead?" He was obviously referring to Ronan. Bai Xinyan curled her lips. I'm not sure. He isn't. The Pope's telepathic thoughts had been absent for a long time. They reappeared and reverberated within the tree nest. But his words confirmed that the structure of the mental plane had already lost its stability. The telepathic transmission was illusory and illusory. There seemed to be a dark flame burning in the corner, creating disturbances from time to time. The Pope, however, had no intention of mending the situation. He described in detail what was happening at the moment in a rare instance. We have broken the framework that he had erected, and broken the rules that he had forcefully inserted, but there is still a certain distance between us and his existence. Distance. Maybe it's only a centimeter. Maybe it's 1,000 kilometers. Maybe it's in another space and time. You mean? There is no point in delving into this. Look, the fortification is being restored. In fact, we are shuttling through its huge and precise construction site. Every water molecule we have come into contact with could be the building material for the next construction. Even though Hoshino Sutoto's spirit was extremely dispirited, he still subconsciously turned his gaze to look through the viewing platform. He looked at the gradually darkening sky and the scattered clouds. In fact, he couldn't see anything special about it. It was probably because of his first impression. He felt that the flying cotton-like objects around the airship were suffused with a faint spiritual light. There were faintly discernible trajectories that interweaved to form the outline of a grand building. At this time, Bai Xinyan asked, "What do we do next?" "We don't do anything. That attack just now practically mobilized all the power that can be mobilized at this distance. Since we weren't able to make the final decision, we won't be able to do anything to him for a while." Bai Xinyan and Hoshino Sutoto didn't know how to respond. If the Pope's words were to spread, Luo Nan's evaluation in the inner world would probably soar by several levels. Oh, it seemed like there was no one who could rise by several levels? After a few seconds, Bai Xinyan said, "Your Majesty exerted force just to reach this conclusion?" It sounded like sarcasm at first, but in reality, it was very formal. The Pope's response was very calm. "I just feel that there is no need to hold an educational competition. Young people are so pure. They are researching this battle on the spot. They have probably forgotten their original goal. Do they want to be high profile? Or do they want to be low-key? What's important is that Chenju has been led into a rhythm by him. She has forgotten today's goal. Fortunately, I still remember. Your Majesty's goal is to find that interferer of Ban City? You suspect that it is Luo Nan?" Bai Xinyan's telepathic thoughts suddenly became straightforward. The Pope took advantage of the situation to continue. "Look, the situation has become clear. Today we have at least verified that he has this ability. Don't say doubt. That will only make people more confused." Confused? His ability exceeds expectations, but his critical performance deviates. He can't see through the inside. Of course he will be confused. Oh, so he encountered a confusing choice when doing a multiple-choice question? The Pope's telepathic thoughts seemed to be laughing. "Child, reality has never been a question. Only a young man with a straight and narrow eye would need to be matched one by one, to be flawless. Right now, I just need to know that he is a fellow that needs to be taken seriously." The telepathic thoughts continued, but the structure of the tree nest could no longer support itself. It suddenly collapsed and turned into nothingness. Chapter 857. The tree nest on the spiritual plane collapsed, and the participants who were passively trapped in it returned to the real world. The natural curtain of night descended once again, like a thick blanket, blocking the field of vision, giving people a sense of self-deception and peace of mind. The Pope, who was in charge of the situation, left. The observation deck remained silent. Kitano Sukito and Bai Xinyan had their own thoughts, until the swarm of signals and communication devices connected, filling the space with ringing and vibrations. Kitano Sukito coughed again and raised his wrist. There was a list of communication requests from the Tamagawa family and their surrounding social circles. However, in the past half an hour, the first-class cabin had been an isolated island of information. There was almost no communication going in or out. On the other hand, the other areas of the airship maintained contact with the outside world. So this was not a signal interruption, but it was 100 times more terrifying. Because this was due to some kind of tacit understanding, and also due to some kind of silent majesty. The source was naturally the Amaterasu cult. There was no more obvious fact than this. The Amaterasu cult was the master of Osaka City, the undisputed ruler of traditional political and military forces like the Tamkawa family. Looking at the source, it was only 20 to 30 years ago. At Kitano Tsukito's age, he had witnessed the entire process of the rise of the Amaterasu cult. This was the power and effect of a transcendent. If that was the case, the other side should be very fast. Kitano Tsukito suddenly shivered. After stirring up a scene that was almost out of control, the Pope patted his butt and left. The true God probably wouldn't stay either, but the other side of the conflict was clearly still here. At this time, the intercontinental airship had completely passed through the ruins of the cumulonimbus cloud cluster. It was said that the cloud pass was still being rebuilt, and it had been completely left behind. But what was the point of such a small distance for a transcendent of that level? Thinking of this, Kitano Tsukito did not have the mood to respond to the swarm of communication requests. His muscles tensed up, and he struggled to stand up from the ground. He wanted to respond effectively, but he was at a loss. Don't worry, under the mask of rationality, Professor Luo is not the kind of person to vent his anger on others. Speaking of which, we are also victims. Although he agreed with this self-assessment, was it really okay to say it so bluntly? Bai Xinyan's breathless voice didn't comfort him at all. Instead, it made him feel even more uneasy. Right now, he even felt that there was a piercingly cold will being injected into every single water molecule around him. It seemed that the next step would be to penetrate into his flesh and bones, see through everything, and sketch out life and death. Professor Luo could definitely do it. Subconsciously, Kitano Tsukito put a hand on his chest, hoping to stabilize his abnormal heartbeat. At the same time, a faint light appeared before his eyes. It was Bai Xinyan opening the virtual workspace. What was shown in the work area was work. TSK, such a thing has just happened, and yet, you're forcing me to sign it without any consolation. How cold-blooded and foolish. It turns out that I'm surrounded by a nest of giant lizards with only their cruel nature left. What? Actually, Kitano Tsukito wasn't sure if Bai Xinyan was talking to him, but it felt better to chat at this time. While Bai Xinyan was operating in the virtual workspace, she refuted, "It's already like this, and you still want to stir up trouble in Osaka. Of course I refuse." Kitano Tsukito opened his mouth. He felt like he was watching a stage play. Bai Xinyan's expression and actions were on point, but there was a strong sense of deliberate intent, as if she was purposely putting on a show for someone to see. It was really a satirical play that made people unable to laugh. At this time, Bai Xinyan had finished her work. She turned around and kindly continued to comfort him. "Mr. Kitano, it's almost over. Look at the two of us. One is a bodyguard, and the other is a kept woman. We both have masters to serve, and from time to time, we have to expand our service scope. Our lives are already so hard. Why do we have to think about things outside of our duties? What if * King Sugar Daddy?" Finally, Kitano Tsukito remembered that this was an analogy that Bai Xinyan had used when she was talking to Yukawa Aishuk. In fact, it was still an analogy. Yes, we just have to be loyal to our duties. Kitano Tsukito bowed to Bai Xinyan, and his gaze landed on the first-class cabin behind the observation deck. Right now, the first-class cabin was a mess. A group of bodyguards had survived the disaster, but their soul power had just evaporated. Each of them looked like they were in a daze. Yukawa Aishuk was still lying in the aisle, and the almost forgotten Shanbei Xiaohui was still there. This was a situation that required a lot of effort to clean up. Then again, compared to other related situations, this might be the easiest to clean up. Kitano Tsukito began to busy himself with the aftermath. During this time, communication requests from the outside world continued to come in. These requests came from all sorts of directions, but their focus areas were highly overlapping. Thus, a series of high-frequency words were formed. The Amaterasu Order, the Pope, the True God. These words were definitely inescapable, but they would always add some evasive modifiers. In comparison, another word was much more direct. Luonan, Luonan, Luonan. Buzz, buzz, buzz. It's weird. Luonan floated under the water of Beishan Lake. A strand of his consciousness was anchored in the clouds 1,000 kilometers away. Doing two things at once was no big deal for him, But there was still some pressure when it came to analyzing and designing the space-time configuration. He needed to be more focused. At least half of Luo Nan's mind was still focused on the moment when the sun wheel descended and bombarded the pass in the clouds. He watched as the sun wheel jumped out of nothingness, crushed the obstruction of the space-time structure, and smashed down on his head. It was just like in a war game, when an exploding fireball was about to hit the player, and then the game was over. Strictly speaking, the game had already been reread once. Luo Nan's game character, the space-time bubble he controlled, had already collapsed. It was like this for a moment. The key to the impact of the falling sun wheel was not the impact. The fatal killing move originated from the instantaneous explosive distortion of the surrounding void environment. The space-time structure was illusory yet thick, empty yet tenacious. But it could still deform in the end, especially when the power of an extraordinary detonated the turbulent tsunami of the abyssal region. Then it interfered with the material plane and focused on the instantaneous explosion. The powerful distortion had already touched upon the plane of laws. It squeezed out all the redundancy in the space-time structure. Luo Nan couldn't even muster the thought of resisting. He could determine that if he forcefully digested the instantaneous explosive power, the space-time bubble would certainly not be able to withstand it. The pressure would inevitably return to his body. The sandwich domain was fine, but the exoskeleton frame was already damaged. It would most likely not be able to withstand the pressure. So Luo Nan let it happen. The space-time bubble collapsed, but the net's core, which had been pouring into the void, was still preserved. Luo Nan quickly reconstructed on this foundation. There was a gap of about 2 seconds between the collapse and the reappearance. It was short, but for the true God and the Pope, 2 seconds was enough to explain the most crucial problem. The space-time bubble was highly suspicious in its nothingness. I made a mistake. Luo Nan admitted that he had avoided direct damage in that instantaneous collision, but he had also lost his strategic target. He had allowed the true God and the Pope to see part of his bottom line, which would inevitably cause him to be passive. But who would have thought that the true God and the Pope, two extraordinaries, would actually join hands to deal with a junior like him? That's right. The attack of the solar wheel descending had the true God providing the output and the Pope controlling it. The two extraordinaries had synchronously controlled the propping mulberry tree's great divine treasure system, giving Luo Nan a head-on blow. This blow had shattered Luo Nan's disguise. It had also forced him to reveal the level of his ability. It had made him expose, or at least partially expose, his strategic intent. The following problems would certainly be very thorny. But then again, the true God and the Pope had exposed a lot of information in that moment. Especially the Pope's tree nest structure. It used Yukawa Aishuk and the others as fulcrum and fuel. Admittedly, it saved quite a bit of strength, making it possible to strike a thunderous blow from over 1,000 kilometers away. But at the same time, he had also given Luo Nan a chance. This allowed the altar spiderweb, which had been laid out earlier to probe into the human heart, to seep in. Similarly, Yukawa Aishuk and the others acted as fulcrum, as well as a medium and channel. The subjective perspectives and operations of the true God and the Pope during the pursuit and the solar wheel descending attack were transmitted back one after another. This was an exquisite operation built upon the level and train of thought of extraordinaries. It was built upon the foundation of the propping mulberry tree's great divine treasure system. Even if Luo Nan had been in the game, he would not have been able to experience this level of detail by relying solely on Yukawa Aishuk and Kitano Suzuto. However, Luo Nan had borrowed the altar's spiderweb to integrate various perspectives. He had cleverly increased the precision and sensitivity of these detectors. He had discarded the blurred, distorted, and exaggerated impressions, forming a stream of information that was like a high-definition video. He could even play it frame by frame and study it over and over again. There was no more beautiful replay than this. Also, Luo Nan felt that he needed to re-evaluate the effects of the Daydream Nightmare incident. It was precisely this early investment that allowed the breadth and depth of the altar's spiderweb to grow explosively. If it weren't for the need of today's actual combat, Luo Nan would not have known that 99% of the passengers on the intercontinental airship had already been pulled into their homes by the spiderweb. It was just a matter of how deep the spiderweb was. Just how many of them would be needed in the entire world to analyze the situation on the airship. As the spiderweb was spread out, the Wraith sign clearly became more and more accustomed to this world. In the past, the human-faced arachnid was fine when it was in the abyss region of the polar domain. But once it sunk into the material plane and probed into the sea of consciousness, It was absolutely impossible to hide from extraordinaries. Some keen psychic ability users were able to sense it. But now, the altar's spiderweb was universally connected. It had practically become a part of the hearts of the entire world. Its concealment ability had become inconceivable. Who didn't have a dark corner where the web had gathered dust? It was just a bit noisy. Chapter 858. By Sinyan. You scheming B***TCH. You've gone too far. The long-awaited instructions came back, and Captain Jimmy's mentality completely collapsed. He roared as he kicked the chair in front of him, and his arm almost hit the nose of the SCA's Minister de Yuan. His entire body had turned into a terrifying storm. It was the team's deputy Monroe, who was sweating profusely as he tried his best to calm him down. Boss, calm down. Calm down. Captain Jimmy continued to roar back. Calm down, dog *T. Dog *T process. Every step in here is a piece of garbage pasted with dog *T. Then what about you, the initiator? That sentence could not be said no matter what. Monroe could only stretch out his arms and make a pressing motion, using all his expression and body language to persuade his boss, who was on the verge of losing his mind. This is a critical time, Jimmy. Think about the airship over 1,000 kilometers away. Think about that state. That state of being raised by AB*TCH. That Blackheart Salt is doing this on purpose. This is a shady deal between her and the Blood Flame Order. She's seizing every opportunity possible. Being stared at by Captain Jimmy's charcoal-like eyes, Monroe's mind was momentarily taken away. Aside from being overwhelmed by his aura, he also felt the grade suppression of the 7th-generation dynamo core. His mouth opened and closed twice, but he couldn't finish his sentence in time. Great, if she wants to disgust us with the process, I'll accompany her to the end. It's just another round of dog *T. I'll report the new discovery to the East Asia Department. Are you deaf? Memory loss? You didn't even record the large piece of intelligence analysis just now? If you want me to collect your salary on your behalf, I'll break your spine as a thank you gift. Captain Jimmy's roar could practically tear open the roof of the warehouse. The poor intelligence officer was suddenly targeted. He didn't even dare to raise his head as he began to work with a sullen face. The intelligence officer's memory was actually far better than that of an ordinary person, and his writing skills were also pretty good. He quickly converted Captain Jimmy's forcefully twisted logical analysis into a rigorous and meticulous document form. Seeing the content of his imagination quickly materialize into words, Captain Jimmy finally grinned. He already couldn't wait to sign and send it over. He didn't expect this kind of one-sided statement to be able to move the bureaucrats of the East Asia Department, as long as it could have the effect of disgusting by Sinyan. Captain Jimmy's expression suddenly changed. BZZT BZZT BZZT. The sudden vibration signal affected all the members of the operation team in the warehouse. There was almost no delay. At this moment, the dynamo core determined that the main body was in peaceful mode, and immediately displayed the received information on their retinas. Captain Jimmy choked again. He wanted to vent his anger, but in the face of such a high priority order, he had to temporarily suppress his emotions. Remote conference? Menda pondered over the core words of the notice, but he was also confused. The fewer words, the bigger the matter. A simple meeting notice was sent to every team member, bypassing the frontline commanders. Even when he wasn't at war, he was still extraordinary. Most importantly, it had come at the right time. Boss, the meeting will start in 10 minutes. Do you think? Men turned his gaze to the SCA's Minister O'Hara. Captain Jimmy's black and red face still had traces of distortion, but he didn't make a sound and only turned his head to the side. Mend let out a sigh of relief and immediately fulfilled his duties as an assistant. He put on a smile and politely asked Minister O'Hara and the other SCA officials and staff to leave. If they wanted to wait outside, they could wait outside. If they didn't want to, no one would care even if they went home. This layer of buffer was awkward but effective. When Mend turned his head, Captain Jimmy had already sat down with his eyebrows furrowed. The intelligence personnel who were chased away felt like they had been pardoned. They focused on adjusting the remote channel and preparing for the meeting. Video conference? Reality conference? Tactical conference? After a quick exchange, The emotions of the operation team members in the warehouse were much more relaxed. They weren't unfamiliar with this kind of situation. As the new generation of burners equipped with the 7th generation Dynamo core and operating the latest Deep Blue platform, they were originally expensive experimental subjects. They were deployed all over the world to carry out various missions in order to continuously send back experimental data to support subsequent research. On a more realistic level, they also needed to form a brand new tactical system based on the new platform. It had already become a habit to have a tactical conference every 2 or 3 days to exchange experiences. Things like tonight, which consumed a large amount of resources to achieve the effect of long-distance reality communication on a global scale, only proved the importance of this conference. Captain Jimmy needed to carry out this conference as a tactical command. Everyone in the warehouse became busy. Have the surveillance personnel been withdrawn? In position in 4 minutes. Warning system? Activated. Inspecting mental link. Link node clear. Group synchronization rate at 97%. Connecting to Mirror Image 1 network. Connected. Two-way synchronization initiated. Environmental interference index normal. Captain Jimmy glanced at it and saw that the interference rate was floating around 2%. This rate was very low and had no practical value. However, it was already a relatively ideal state for long-distance communication. If it was a requirement for actual combat, it would be at least 10%, which was probably the standard of the previous version of formatted space. Their operation team's record was 47%. As for the laboratory environment, the highest record was a heaven-defying 70%, which was said to be able to kill even extraordinaries. Frankly speaking, up until now, Captain Jimmy wasn't particularly proficient in this kind of combat style. The laboratory, on the other hand, was thinking of all kinds of ways and opportunities to deepen the impression of this batch of experimental subjects. Reality information loading. Countdown to login. 3, 2, 1. The archetype format symbol that represented the transfer to virtual reality appeared and instantly enlarged. When the tetrahedron, inscribed, and circumscribed spheres expanded to the limit of vision, the emptiness of the central region opened up. The astral winds and clouds in the sky wrapped in the boundless dark curtain of night and rushed towards them. This might be a real scene, or it might be a completely virtual product. Captain Jimmy habitually moved his limbs, but the low interference rate and emptiness made this movement meaningless. He gave up on the warm-up and turned to look around. His operation team had finished assembling and was now in this airspace. In other directions, figures appeared one after another. Most of them were familiar faces. They were all burners who carried the Apocalypse Experimental 7th Generation Dynamo core. Director Yen is over there. Captain Jimmy quickly saw that their true leader, Yen Yonghua, who was known as the pioneer among burners, was not far to the side. He was a gloomy and paranoid guy. More importantly, his authority over the Dynamo core was one level higher than most of the people here. Whether it was public or private, Captain Jimmy had to go and greet him. Hold on. Mend stopped him for a moment, indicating for Captain Jimmy to observe Yen Yonghua's expression. I'm afraid he's not in a good mood. Oh. Virtual reality allowed everyone's external appearance and expression to obtain a high degree of restoration. It could be seen that Yen Yonghua's bad mood was already visible on his face. His face was ashen, clearly indicating that others should stay away. Captain Jimmy was also in a state of violent rage a few minutes ago, but when he saw Yen Yonghua's expression, he suddenly felt that it was better to calm down a bit. Discussing their superiors was everyone's common hobby. Jimmy and Mend were no exception. I remember that he was in a good mood a few days ago. He was waiting to watch a good show. It's an auction. He's waiting for Professor Luo to make a fool of himself. TSK. The two of them understood. It was at this time that a clear graphic presentation appeared in the night of virtual reality. It went straight to the point, informing everyone of the topic of this conference. Nature of the conference. Tactical seminar. Objective of the conference. Conduct an analysis and research on atypical extraordinaries and formulate a targeted tactical plan. Case reference, Intercontinental Airship Attack and Defense Battle Keywords, Luo Nan, True God, Pope of 100 Collections, Configuration. The night sky slightly rippled, and in the next second, an airship appeared in the clouds below. The airship indicator light attracted the gazes of most of the participants. Buzzing sounds of discussion arose. Since this was a tactical seminar, the public channels were all open. The participants who entered virtual reality could use voice, text, images, and even telepathically to communicate with each other. Everyone's information network was quite well informed. They were all very sensitive to the focus of the event. Wow, they really are up to date. The real scene is transcoded. It's not a simulation. Is this first-hand information? Where did it come from? Look at this perspective. It's a mosaic of satellite images. How many satellites did they call over? Then what do you think of this close-up view? The emotions and curiosity of the participants were quickly squeezed out by the fast-paced, high-intensity conference. In reality, the vast majority of meaningless exchanges were suppressed to the point where they disappeared without a trace by the time the demonstration advanced to the stage of the chase between the true god and Luo Nan. And when the grand scene of the sun wheel descending and the cloud pass shattering arrived, everyone was already dizzy from the dazzling scene and the enormous flow of information. Captain Jimmy was one of those who were dizzy. The entire process was played once in less than half an hour. The edited version was played at least 20 times, and the key joints were emphasized over and over 200 times. He was still dizzy even when he returned to the real world. His left eye was the sun, his right eye was lightning, and his brain was full of the cloud pass that was being assembled, burst apart, and then pieced back together. What the hell are they talking about? Yeah, most of it was just guessing. Men's effect of listening to the lecture wasn't much better than Captain Jimmy's. Of course there were explanations in the real scene demonstration. But there were configurations on the left, configurations on the right, and some space-time structure in the middle. The storm of the gully region, coupled with the chaotic and complex structural analysis of the cloud pass, was completely directed in the direction of evaporating one's brain juice. Captain Jimmy was baffled. If one had to consider all these messy things during battle, how would one fight? Perhaps it was because of this that he was holed up in the operations team as a squad leader. But come to think of it, those who had a higher status and authority than him might not be any better off today. The information vibrated over. He glanced at it and felt a little dizzy again. F***CK. Those people from East Asia Institute. Ha, this is good. Mend was baffled. What's wrong? Hee, they're using us to return a favor. Ha! The tactical example just now, the one that just came out, seems to have returned the favor and taken it from the Amaterasu cult. For this, we have to return the favor and temporarily help the Amaterasu cult. We're helping the Amaterasu cult in Band City? Can we afford to? That's what it means, high-level thugs? Captain Jimmy didn't mind at all. Rather than working for someone else, he was more interested in getting out of this boring old warehouse and actually doing something useful. Whether it was dealing with the vagrants or higher-level enemies. Mend, on the other hand, was thinking about something more practical. Who should we contact with the Amaterasu cult? This East Asia Institute is a little too much. Captain Jimmy was stunned. He looked at the contents of the mission again. There was no explanation in this regard at all. This was more troublesome. He tried to find the East Asia Institute to clarify things. Just then, he received an instant message. Captain Jimmy's expression changed immediately when he saw the message. Mend glanced at it and saw the words. By Xinyan. He snorted in his heart and instinctively thought of the worst. He looked at Captain Jimmy again. At this moment, his expression was even worse than Yen Yongbua's. In the sky above Ban City Airport, indicator lights and radio signals intertwined. After 4 to 5 hours of tossing and turning, the huge intercontinental airship returned to the airport. Sigh. On the airship that was about to land by Xinyan's side. Her slender fingers caressed her forehead, pretending to be weak. I told you that your soul power has evaporated and your mind is damaged. You need to rest. Why didn't you listen to me? Kitano Suzuto glanced at her. He had enough of her exaggerated acting skills. The one who didn't need to act to show that he was extremely worried was his boss. Yukawa Aishuk gripped the outer edge of the space capsule tightly. His entire body was tense and rooted to the spot. It was as if he was facing a life-and-death situation. In fact, in Yukawa Aishuk's eyes, the airship that was about to land at Ban City Airport and himself on the airship were bait that was about to be thrown into the devil's mouth. In the future, he would only be eroded by acid. It's all Luo Nan's fault. It's all Luo Nan's fault. Luonan. Chapter 859. Sister Yuan, it's true. I just went for a spin. The subsequent developments were completely unexpected. It's nothing. It's really nothing. My limbs are all gone. I didn't even spit out a mouthful of blood. The situation has been too chaotic recently. I need you to take care of the family. Sister Cat Eyes. Hee hee, you worship me? Then don't make fun of me in the group. I used a portion of the principles of the lamination interference technique in the battle, but it can't be considered a mature application. I will summarize the specifics of the situation, and then we will discuss it. Although Luonan had done many world-shaking things during the time he had been away from home, it was only during the previous half an hour that he had taken out his own name. It was during this half an hour that he needed to spend several dozen times the time to deal with the subsequent effects that followed. The Xia City branch was certainly in an uproar. Actually, the inner world was already in a storm not long after the incident. The information channels originating from the Amaterasu Order and Quantum Corporation had already spread the connection between Luonan and this matter. But at the time, the situation was unclear. The battle situation was tense. No one dared to contact him for fear of disturbing Luonan's attention, giving the enemy an opportunity to take advantage of. The group of people were scared witless. They did not dare to casually send messages until the end of the battle. Luonan still had a conscience, or perhaps it could be said that he had a guilty conscience. He took the initiative to leave the silent state of communication and find Yuan to explain the course of events. This caused a second explosion in his circle of friends. Luonan spent a bit of time communicating and explaining to his family and friends in Xia City. This was not difficult. Let's not talk about the reason. Everyone understood his current situation. They respected his choice and strength. They would not drag him into asking questions. The true trouble was outside of his network of connections. Luonan, Luonan, Luonan. Whether it was during the silent state of communication or during the communication with his friends, Luonan's ears and heart never had a moment of rest. Yes, his method of misleading true gods and the Pope with his game character had failed. But this spectacular failure was like the strike of the falling sun chakram. It smashed into the hearts of millions of people in the world. And the vast majority of these millions of people had a thin spider thread extracted from their mental plane. The threads interweaved and scattered, building a complex and deep spider web. Now what he sensed was the echoes of the emotions transmitted by the thousands of people through the spider web. As for the exact number of tens of thousands of people, currently, there are already 90,000 stable cage bubbles on the altar's spiderweb? 100,000? A stable cage represents an awakened who have cultivated successfully. How many people are there in the entire inner world? According to Luonan's impression of the latest statistics, the number of registered ability users in the entire world was only around 76,000. This was the result of explosive growth in the last half year. Of course, this number did not include the nomads of the wilderness, the military's burners, and the ever-increasing number of human mutants. But even if these people were included, the number of people bound to Luonan's altar spiderweb covered over 90% of the world's awakened. As for the ability users that were even further away, similar to worker Zhai before he awakened, their numbers were 10 times greater than the previous group. Without a doubt, this was another full coverage. As for the bubbles of ordinary people that were born and extinguished with the passage of time, their scale was enormous, and their changes were rapid. They had already lost the meaning of statistics. Rather than calculating numbers, it was better to evaluate the breadth of the space they covered. It was more or less the same as the soul cloak. There definitely weren't this many in the past. Luonan had done a similar inventory before. It definitely wasn't on this scale. He had already guessed why. The Daybreak Nightmare is very powerful. The Abyss World's might is boundless. But right now, this isn't the main point. Luonan's current name was only known by a few people in the government, the military, and the upper echelons of the business world. But from the perspective of the inner world, Luonan's name could already be said to shake the world. There was no one who didn't know him. Especially this sort of freshly minted extraordinary information. It involved extraordinaries, and it also stirred the secular world into action. It formed a news event with global influence. Anyone who was close to this circle could not avoid talking about it a few times. In this way, hundreds and thousands of people revolved around Luo Nan every minute and every second. Their thoughts unfolded, and they even conversed with this name. A storm of information and a maelstrom with no end gradually converged within the constantly changing space and time. If it were someone else, this storm would only exist within the transmission and storage of various media, relying on a material carrier to exist. But for Luo Nan, it was a different situation. The altar spiderweb stood in the void, appearing and disappearing in the hearts of people. The noise that echoed in the mind was like the vibrating hum of mosquitoes and flies. Not only did it make clear the core meaning, it also informed every noise-making node without restraint of the location, medium of transmission, flow trajectory, and even emotional color. This was the resonance between the human communication network and the altar's spiderweb. It was the deep level of information in the material and mental domains. It was the comprehensive feedback of Luo Nan's deep and rich layers of senses. At this very moment, Luo Nan's eyes and the bottom of his heart reflected such a complicated background and complex world. It was precisely because of the complexity that the noise surged with large amounts of repetitive and redundant information. It formed a surging flood that washed over him without end. This is a bit annoying. Though he said this, Luo Nan's state of mind was still quite calm. It was unknown when it started, but dealing with this information storm that could collapse and burn brain cells had already become a part of Luo Nan's daily life. The grand structure of the living starry sky, the global coverage of the soul cloak, the trillions of fragments of the misty maze, the sun wheel and absolute purgatory formed together into the abyss world. Again and again, each wave was more powerful than the last. In the end, Luo Nan was equipped with an immunity. This made him no longer drift with the tide. Instead, he followed his own logic to buffer, precipitate, divide, and even analyze and integrate the enormous amount of information. In fact, the information storm that surrounded Luo Nan was much more regular than the attacks he had suffered before. The regularity represented familiarity and order. Luo Nan subconsciously muttered, "Oh me." At this time, he was the incarnation of a small wooden stick that reached into the cotton candy machine. From the grand structure of heaven, earth, and the hearts of people, he accumulated sugar threads to form a marvelous cloud-like creation. It would be quite good if he could create cotton candy with ordinary craftsmanship. But if he used himself as a yardstick, transformed his knowledge into rules, measured the hearts of people, and followed the law to create things. Luo Nan closed his eyes, and his thoughts naturally poured into the altar's spiderweb. Within the complex layers of the network, on the back of the wraith sign that climbed up and down, within the flood of information and life force that weaved back and forth, there seemed to be an incorporeal 3D printer operating, causing a certain silhouette to gradually appear. That appearance was that of Luo Nan. Compared to Luo Nan of the real world, the two were like human figures inside and outside a mirror. They were mirror images of each other. Only some of the details weren't perfect enough. They needed to be corrected. Chapter 860. Everyone has a heart that strives for perfection. They want to fix imperfections. Luo Nan's thoughts shuttled back and forth on the mirror image, comparing it with each other. It was more or less the action of looking into a mirror, and the more he examined and corrected it, the more detailed the mirror image revealed. This was not strange. This was because this was the accumulation of images, emotions, and calculations in the hearts of hundreds of thousands of people. Thanks to the blessing of modern imaging technology, very few people would mistake him. At the very least, they had a basic understanding of his appearance. This guaranteed the basic recognition of the mirror image. But under the appearance of convergence, everyone had their own understanding of Luo Nan in their hearts. Just as the saying goes, different people have different opinions. The vast majority of people had fixed impressions based on the guidance of various media, but they more or less had their own opinions. There were overpraise, prejudice, vilification. And they were using modern convenient channels of information to rapidly communicate with each other, influencing and overlaying each other. In this way, the corresponding accumulation of images became more and more cumbersome, redundant, complex, and contradictory. Most importantly, it was distorted. This gave Luo Nan the fulcrum to pry open people's hearts. But it was precisely this distortion that passed through the spiderweb of the altar and converged onto the mirror image. The surface was calm, but the inside was conflicting and colliding with each other. It could collapse and fall apart at any time. The reason why it did not collapse was because the mirror image existed in advance. It was the basic core that Luo Nan had already established. It was built on the foundation of formatting theory. It went through the polishing of the 9 orifices 6 roots martial arts philosophy. It went through the deepening of coupling theory, and it went through the immersion of the condensation ring and other configuration concepts. Luo Nan relied on this to construct the glorious and resplendent living starry sky, touching upon every corner of the complex and real world. Of course, the system brought by the Wraith sign had always surrounded and influenced him. And all of this, if traced back to the source, could be attributed to the abyssal world sun wheel and absolute hell. It was a vast and dangerous balance. Luo Nan had deduced this when he researched the lamination interference technique. Now he naturally used it. It was this clear dissection that anchored a relatively stable fulcrum for Luo Nan between heaven, earth, and the hearts of people. The changes of the wind and clouds in the surroundings had a fixed foundation. It could be deduced and born from basic rules. Of course, these rules were still fuzzy, but they were already divided into near and far, virtual and real and illusory. Even in the complex overlapping space and time, in the distorted and chaotic bewilderment of the hearts, they could still firmly exist. And on this foundation, they dealt with the distorted image transmitted by the altar's spiderweb and deduced more essential things. Overall, this core might not be and the core might not be perfect, but its source was clear and the direction was correct. At this moment, it could be seen that the torrent of thoughts formed by hundreds of thousands of people was not entirely a burden. It was good to have those distortions, contradictions, and conflicts. Though some of the images of Luo Nan in people's hearts weren't realistic enough, they were proven to be achievable through deduction. They harvested some fantastic ideas. Some of them appeared to be very reasonable, but after deduction, they discovered that their current strength was insufficient. There were also some that were completely off the mark in their deductions. Their roots were wrong, and they didn't belong to him at all. So in Luo Nan's eyes, the mirror image on the altar's spiderweb grew more and more real. The distorted and chaotic elements were gradually expelled from the mirror image. They were like clouds of mist, spiraling and undulating. Oh, was it a misconception? Luo Nan suddenly sensed something. The veil of invisibility that his main body carried seemed to have become a bit thicker. That's right. Luo Nan even captured the source of the change. The mist that had been expelled formed a mirror image as well. It crossed the barrier between real and illusory, entering the domain of the real world. It reacted with the veil of invisibility, fusing with the veil of invisibility. It was an order that had existed long ago. Luo Nan's thoughts followed the distorted elements and transformed mist. They naturally entered the depths of the veil of invisibility, touching upon the veil of mist and the order that had existed long ago. It was like an ornament that hung behind a gauze curtain. It was faintly discernible, but it was arranged in disorder and categorized. Every individual ornament was a convoluted creation of its own rules. There seemed to be some sort of orderly connection between them. Without a doubt, these were all things that had been analyzed, used, and stored by the stacking interference technique. When combined with the essence of this technique, it was like a mask. As long as one put it on, one would instantly become another person. Of course, the vast majority of these masks could not be used. After all, Luo Nan had yet to create a true corresponding spirit core. He had only drafted a private version of the configuration design. This was the difference between the public version and the private version. There were many intelligent and automated steps that required him to do it personally. He had to research and ponder over them one by one to find the corresponding activation program. Only then could he use them. But in any case, he had walked the right path. Not only did the previous accumulations exist within the veil of invisibility, new elements were constantly precipitating. They grew in number and clarity. They originated from Luo Nan himself. They came from his core. All sorts of abilities, skills, and rules were analyzed within the core. They were transformed into materials and components, arranged in order. All sorts of designs were needed to be pieced together in order to finally form a complete and logical mask template. For example, based on the condensation ring, he had already derived skills such as the water drop sword and soul cloak. Going even more complicated, the cloud pass he had just created involved basic materials from other domains and was pieced together under the rules of the configuration system. But from the looks of it, this was just a semi-finished product. He needed to review and research many times before he could finally take shape. And even if he did take shape, this kind of template would be relatively monotonous. Was he supposed to go out and fight enemies? Was he supposed to hide inside like a tortoise? He needed to bring out a set of combo punches. Of course, this series of materials that belonged to Luo Nan had already been integrated into his current default template framework. Overall, it was already quite mature. And this default template seemed to be able to perform more perfectly than Luo Nan's body and soul framework. After all, this was the product of theorization. Speaking of which, the stacking interference technique was very much like an analytical tool when used. It could perform an in-depth analysis of the various elements contained within itself, or it could perform combinatorial experiments. It was simply like a laboratory cum dressing room. It was an extremely efficient operating environment. But no matter how efficient it was, Luo Nan still needed to expend quite a bit of effort to reassemble a new template, especially one that could completely conceal his identity. Luo Nan found a new toy, and his mind naturally fiddled with it. During this process, the mirror image on the altar's spiderweb and his true self in the real world intersected and fused on a deeper level. The space-time bubble around his body correspondingly transformed into a faintly discernible mist. It was lively and fleeting. It seemed to be supported by an incorporeal flow of air, and sunlight and moonlight rotated and poured into it. It transformed into boundless colors and shapes. And as he fiddled with it, the original decorations and the new products that had gradually accumulated flowed through his mind like a horse lantern, allowing him to inspect his memories. This one had just been precipitated. It was useful. It was too simple. This one looked very reliable, but he couldn't find the right door to enter. And this one. Ha! Luo Nan's mind suddenly came into contact with something that was half old and half new. It was like a bizarre mountain range hidden by clouds and mist. There were grotesque rocks and jagged rocks that spiraled and stacked on top of each other. They formed a structure of their own, and magma snaked and flowed within. At first glance, it looked like a mountain of flames in the depths of fiendish prison. But its relatively flat peak and its corresponding layout made it look more like a special altar model. The Blood Soul Temple? Chapter 861. Snake Tongue suddenly woke up from her meditative state. The living room of the yacht was empty. Yinlu was nowhere to be seen. The virtual work area was still lit up, and the interface was constantly refreshing with information. Ability users from all over the world were revolving around the hot topic of last night. Wave after wave of discussions were launched, and the keywords were none other than Luo Nan, the airship, the Amaterasu Order, and so on. For the spectators, the matter was over, and it was time for them to show their strength. But for the people involved, was it really over? Snake Tongue looked at the time. It was approximately 4 in the morning. It had only been 5 or 6 hours since the intercontinental airship incident. The atmosphere in Ban City was still very low, making her heart feel heavy. Snake Tongue adjusted her aura and followed the feeling in her heart. She slowly stood up. There was no one around, but she still took traditional steps out of the living room and took the small elevator to the upper deck. There were few lights on the passenger terminal, but the darkest hour had passed. The railings on the deck chairs, and other decorations all revealed their silhouettes in the dusk. At the same time, there was a figure at the bow of the ship. Who knew how long it had been standing there? Secretary Een. Madam North Mountain. Even though they had adjusted it many times, the way they addressed each other was not precise enough. They were unfamiliar and polite, just like their relationship. Don't you want to rest for a while? There are some matters in the headquarters that need to be dealt with. Thank you for your hard work. D City was 3 hours earlier than Ban City, so it was about time to deal with things. Needless to say, some things did not care about time. Just like this moment. Snake Tongue only casually greeted him. Her gaze and mind were cast outside the yacht. The bow of the anchored yacht was pointing towards the east. The lake was vast, and one could see everything at a glance. One could even see the glaze that had been quietly painted on where the water met the sky. At this time, the ground was still being colored layer by layer. A few clouds were piled there randomly. Stirred by the changing colors, they vaguely turned into indigo mountains, adding a sense of composition to the design. Snake Tongue furrowed her brows slightly. She looked at the sky and clouds in the distance, which were gradually brightening. The feeling in her heart seemed to have been illuminated a little, but it still wasn't vivid enough. Yinlu followed her line of sight and gently exhaled. Is it sunrise? I thought there would be no sun today, thick clouds, and low atmospheric pressure. It doesn't feel good enough. The conversation that had been going on and on was suddenly stuck here. In fact, both sides of the conversation had captured a common understanding from each other's perception. They didn't say anything else and just stared at the boundary of the water and sky from afar. The sun was still below the horizon, but at this moment, in the layers of glaze, in the indigo mist mountain range, there was clearly a different type of power stirring restlessly. It was hidden deep under the vast laws of nature, but it could not wait to stretch out its claws. It was even half a step beyond the newborn sun. In the eastern horizon, it pressed out a ferocious shape. Yun! Yinlu exclaimed. The azure cloud peak that was piled up on the horizon suddenly collapsed. Then, under the distortion of that clear power, branches were pulled out, almost losing the nature that cloud should have, turning into the shadow that came with that power, following the contours of the sky and the water body, extending in all directions. The amount of clouds over there wasn't much. After a few stretches, they became so thin that they couldn't be seen. However, the image of the roots spreading out, piercing into the void, and supporting the structure of water and sky was still deeply engraved in Snake Tongue and Yinli's pupils and hearts. The Fusong Divine Tree. Snake Tongue subconsciously extended her hand, wanting to cover her eyes, but it was already too late. She lowered her arm halfway, and her face turned pale. She had just looked directly at the operation of a high-level power and subconsciously analyzed it. It had caused quite a bit of a backlash for her. Who knew how many unlucky people were like her in the past few minutes in the entirety of Ban City? Yinlu was much better off because she was already used to borrowing the power of the Blood Soul Temple of the Abyss District to observe high-level things. Although the Blood Soul Temple of the Abyss District seemed to have changed again. What method is this? Yinli's mind was suspended in the Abyss District, painstakingly distinguishing the deeper meaning behind the turbulent storm. Unfortunately, her level wasn't high enough. She became more and more confused as she watched. It's nothing more than a seal. Snake Tongue was unable to sense the details, but she understood the gist of it even more. It's not a good thing. Yinli's thoughts were chaotic. The Amaterasu Order wants to make a move in Ban City? This is their headquarters. This isn't the first time. Snake Tongue paused for a moment, then concluded, it just depends on who they're targeting. Yinlu suddenly turned her head. Where is Mr.? Yeah, where was Luo Nan? Even at this critical moment, that person had stubbornly disappeared without a trace. Whether it was Snake Tongue or Yinlu, they could half guess and half feel the faint light of the first rays of dawn. They could feel the gradually extending and gradually permeating psychic pressure. There was still a bit of coolness in the northern mountain lake during the early hours of the morning. But as the faint light of dawn enveloped them, their bodies inexplicably felt a bit hot and dry. It stirred their energies, making them feel quite uncomfortable. This change was much more direct and sharp than the change in the clouds at the edge of the sky. Snake Tongue lowered her eyelids and tightened her mind. She whispered, "Don't expose yourself to the outside." Indeed. Yinlu gave one last glance at the light of the clouds at the edge of the sky. She turned around and walked back, but she hadn't taken 2 steps when she sensed something at the same time as Snake Tongue. In the blink of an eye, the two saw a small flying machine suddenly soar into the sky from the warehouse at the dock. It didn't obey the traffic rules of the peaceful trade market. It flew straight into the clouds and soon disappeared from their line of sight. Yinlu and Snake Tongue glanced at each other. They both furrowed their brows. In this kind of situation, as long as one was an ability user, they would have to make some sort of reaction. However, most of them would be like Yinlu and Snake Tongue. They would be muddle-headed and make guesses. Captain Jimmy's reaction was too obvious. This wasn't strange. After all, they were backed by Quantum Corporation and even the government and military. On the other hand, over at the inner world, the two hurriedly returned to the living room on the lower deck. It was quite strange. As they entered the shadowy area of the cabin, the discomfort brought about by the disturbance of energy naturally calmed down. The effects were immediate. They just didn't know if this was a temporary phenomenon. The projection work area was still flickering at this time. The interface where Luo Nan and the Amaterasu order spammed before finally had some other elements mixed in. Band City, Fantasy Clouds? This topic had just appeared for a few seconds when another freshly baked topic flipped to the top. Band City's sunrise. Please help me decipher it. Vitality is restless? I nearly went berserk just now. The coordinates are the Shitian district of Band City. The divine tree's kingdom of heaven descends. Since the topics discussed in the forum were closely related to Band City, the words that followed easily swept away a large amount of attention from the world. Yinlu opened a few posts and similar topics became very influential. She used the waterfall mode of intelligent categorization to automatically select keywords. She scrolled for over half an hour, but the more she scrolled, the more she scrolled. However, the majority of the posts were pictures, descriptions, conjectures, and the like. Aside from pointing the spearhead at the Amaterasu order, there wasn't anything useful. Yinli's brows furrowed. She wanted to go to a more professional circle to take a look. Just as she left the post page, she saw a new post that was highlighted, pinned to the top, and other effects. It forcefully appeared in the very center of the work area. The bright red words were extremely glaring. Most importantly, the poster was from the Band City branch of the Ability User Society. Yinli's wristband buzzed and vibrated at this moment. She lowered her head to glance at it, and her brows furrowed even tighter. This is troublesome. The forum post opened as she spoke. The information on the wristband was split into two screens and projected onto the work area. The reason why Yinlu did this was because the things described on both sides were exactly the same. Even the words and sentences used were exactly the same. The gist of it was that Band City's side discovered that an extremely dangerous mutant had infiltrated. The Amaterasu order was righteous and had taken the initiative to open a so-called divine nation to protect the safety of the citizens. The Band City branch demanded that all ability users in Band City immediately register online and report their location as well as the brief situation of the nearby ability users. They were to cooperate with the Band City government and the SCA in conducting a comparison of social authority in order to ensure safety and so on. Big Sua's entire city. Is the Band City branch sticking their faces under the feet of a true god? Are they willing to act like cows and horses to play with? The above words weren't said by Yinlu or Snake Tongue. It was the ridicule of some spectator on the forum. However, this person's words hit the nail on the head. As an Ability User Society branch organization without an extraordinary overseeing it, the Band City branch had already been reduced to a vassal of the Amaterasu order over a decade ago. Normally it was invisible. Now that it had jumped out, it was nothing more than a marionette on stage. This is... looking for Mr.? Yinlu and Snake Tongue looked at each other once more. They both felt that trouble was imminent. The power of the Amaterasu order, coupled with the semi-official nature of the Band City branch, really did possess something akin to a legal coercion in the inner world. It was more or less the same as, fight if you don't accept it. Even if they were cooperating, Yinlu could go register, but she was the only candidate who could register. It was true that Snake Tongue had an ordinary identity in Band City, but in the end, it was just a facade. She had always hidden her true identity and notoriety. Not to mention Luo Nan, who had made his debut under the name of Mr. M.O. However, there was no such person as Mr. M.O. in this world. Even though Yinlu had left some arrangements in D-City over the past 2 days, it was enough to deal with normal situations. The people on the ship gathered together and corroborated each other. The logical clues were chaotic. To sum it up, suspects. However, wasn't this a bit of a roundabout way too big? I thought we were going to charge into geosynchronous orbit and then turn back. Isn't Mars better? Captain Jimmy walked into the main hall with large strides. He had circled back from the Quantum Corporation branch in Band City. The private airship had just finished connecting with his flying craft. However, the sarcasm in his words was not limited to his family's itinerary. Bai Xinyan could be seen from afar standing in front of a projected area that was not yet clear. Her complexion was normal, and she was even smiling and greeting Captain Jimmy. Next to her was Yukawa Isuk. He had an unlucky expression on his face. He was sickly and dispirited. He turned a blind eye to Captain Jimmy's arrival. You're beating around the bush because you can't find him. Hee hee, you're still so self-confident. Captain Jimmy was still a bit confused about the new mission he had been assigned. He only knew that he was to assist the Amaterasu Order in finding a powerful individual who had been in hiding for a long time. However, this did not stop him from fiercely attacking Bai Xinyan when the opportunity presented itself. This is the truth. The Amaterasu Order has used methods that are close to flipping the table. From sunrise until now, they still haven't locked onto their target. Bai Xinyan carelessly brought up the Amaterasu Order. It said that this is due to the surrounding area having some convoluted and distorted space-time dimensions. Excluding natural phenomena, it's the interference of the extraordinary plane. It's a shielding interference. It's also a big problem. The one who concluded was a middle-aged man of unclear age. He did not come here in person, but rather appeared in the projection area. The most direct impression he gave others was that he was bald. His eyebrows and beard were sparse, and his skin was pale. He gave others the feeling that he didn't have enough nutrients to support the growth of his hair. He looked very thin and weak. Perhaps this had something to do with the large robe he wore. The 7th-generation Dynamo Core had already recorded the data of all the extraordinaries in the world, and it was updated in real time. Captain Jimmy completed the match in the first instance. He immediately straightened his legs and puffed out his chest. Your Majesty. This bald middle-aged man was the Pope of the 100 Collections. Jimmy was still puzzled. This Majesty had just finished attacking Luonan, yet he came back to find trouble. Where was the logic? Captain Jimmy was not an idiot. He looked at the 3 people gathered before him and thought of last night's arduous training. He suddenly grasped the inner connection within. Trouble equals Luonan? Was this scene set up for Luonan? But wasn't that fellow several thousand kilometers away? Could it be that he had returned? Bai Xinyan suddenly asked, Your Majesty, do you think that there's someone behind Luonan? There's no need to rush to conclusions. The Pope of the 100 Collections faintly smiled. His face was sparse with hair, and his expression was amiable. The truth is that there's a strange existence in Ban City right now. He's suspected to be an extraordinary, but he's different from all the other extraordinaries on Earth. Of course, we need to investigate his background. He might not be a living person. If he's not a living person, then what is he? It's hard to estimate. The initial probing won't have any results. After all, I'm not proficient in the mental side. The Pope of the Amaterasu Order Majesty was the spiritual leader of millions of believers. He was the world's top mental extraordinaire. For him to say that he wasn't proficient in the mental side was truly the biggest joke in the world. The Pope still smiled amiably. You can't view the convenience of horse racing as an ability. Besides, there's no future in the mental side. Perhaps you agree? Captain Jimmy discovered that he couldn't get a word in edgewise. He was the same as Yukawa Aishuk next to him. They were completely superfluous. He only heard Bai Xinyan respond. The road ahead was paved by a character like Majesty. How could I think so much? Oh, the registration of the Ban City branch has been updated. Tell me about it. Currently, there are more than 3,400 people registered. Among them, 700 are at least awakened. As she spoke, Bai Xinyan projected another distribution map. With Ban City as the background, the map was dotted with dots of varying density. Next to him, Yukawa Aishuk's pupils dilated slightly. He secretly compared the image with the information he had. He felt that this included almost all the secret orders and supernatural organizations in Osaka. Even if it wasn't 100% accurate, it was close to 80% accurate. Not enough, the Pope said simply. The time limit isn't up yet. This is a problem of attitude. I will convey Majesty's opinion. Bai Xinyan shrugged. Next, Majesty, please arrange for your subordinates to communicate with the various orders and organizations in Ban City. The Ban City branch and the SCA will send a message to those who have records but haven't voluntarily registered. If necessary, they will visit and urge them. All work will be completed by 1:30 p.m. By that time, Ban City will have more or less been plowed, and we can begin the next phase of the operation. Captain Jimmy also stared at the distribution map and searched for relevant information. His mind was racing. After a few seconds, he suddenly spoke. Does our team also need to report? Bai Xinyan glanced at him. Her eyes were clear and calm, But in Captain Jimmy's eyes, there was a hidden meaning. He liked this. Especially liked to destroy this. So he spoke again. For the past few days, we have been neighbors with a few aptitude users. We also watched them work and discuss business. They probably aren't locals of Ban City. So far, it seems like they haven't registered yet? Chapter 862. Around 10 in the morning in Ban City, after nearly 6 hours of fermenting, the internal forum of the Ability User Association was already overflowing with noise. Once the matter was related to personal interests and dignity, the thoughts of the spectators would become a direct sense of immersion. Then it would transform into corresponding emotions. This was what was known as the will of the people. Of course, this sort of thing erased the warm and tender feelings of the so-called legal principles of social order. When it came to crossing the chasm of strength, it was mostly useless. The most obvious evidence was the progress of the registration. It was still advancing steadily, forming a densely woven net that tightened one's flesh. This sort of method completely relied on superior resources to crush them. There wasn't the slightest bit of ingenuity, yet it left people helpless. Truthfully speaking, there was always a bit of buffer space within the crushing of society's resources alone. What truly gave the ability users in Ban City a sense of oppression and suffocation was the sunlight that sprinkled down to every corner of the city. The sun had already risen to the top of their heads. Its heat and penetrative power continued to rise. It didn't matter if one was outdoors or indoors. It didn't matter if one was exposed to direct sunlight or hidden in the shadows. The all-pervasive light waves could always permeate the surroundings of people. They carried the tyrannical interference imprint of the Amaterasu order. They were like demonic eyes floating in the air, radiating a gaze filled with blazing malice. Lu and Snake Tongue were on the bottom deck. For the first time, they felt resentment towards the brilliant lighting design of this area. They had already closed the light baffles of the portholes, isolating them as much as possible from the sunlight. The lights inside were also extinguished to distinguish the direction of the penetrating light. The entire living room was dusky. The only source of light was the virtual work area. Subconsciously, Lu and Snake Tongue had already stopped conversing. Their body movements grew less and less. They even stopped looking at the constantly refreshing forum messages. They each occupied a different angle, curled up their bodies, and restrained their auras. It was as if they were in a narrow and claustrophobic cage under 24-hour surveillance. They were like clay sculptures or wooden statues. They didn't know whether or not they had already been exposed. In fact, it didn't matter whether they knew or not. Right now, all responses and all pretenses would become weak and laughable in the face of the chasm that was like a heavenly moat. Frequently coming into contact with existences of that level, they had a corresponding introspection and self-awareness. Time passed little by little. Snake Tongue's state of mind went from doubt to disturbance, and then gradually returned to tranquility. His rich life experience, especially in the past half a year, had already polished a persevering and tenacious heart. She temporarily couldn't understand life and death, but as long as she could survive, no matter how difficult the situation was, it didn't seem to be more torturous than the previous 200 days. When one's heart calmed down, one's senses would naturally arise. The feeling did not originate from the stimulation of the sky barrier, but from the spiritual level. It was almost a natural disturbance, like air currents and water waves. They had existed since a long time ago, but they were too common, causing people to unconsciously overlook them. Snake Tongue even felt that this wasn't an external stimulus, but rather a subtle and mysterious connection. At this moment, all external activities were immersed in a high-risk environment, and she was under multiple constraints and restrictions. Moreover, it was not a good time to meditate and cultivate, so her attention was naturally drawn by this subtle connection. Furthermore, she also discovered that the other end of the connection, or rather, a key node, was right beside her. It was on Lu, who had also entered a state of silence. This was the so-called subtle mystery. Once the mind was biased, the connection between the two would naturally be strengthened. On the other side, the eyelids of Lu, who had her eyes closed in contemplation, twitched. She opened her eyes to a slit, and her pupils turned slightly to make contact with Snake Tongue's gaze. This allowed her to further confirm that the connection really did exist, and it was extremely sharp. Was this a type of mutual telepathy? It was more or less related to Luonan. When was it established? What was the point of safety in the current situation? The thoughts in Snake Tongue's mind couldn't help but grow, but she soon came to a realization. There was no meaning in thinking about these things because she most likely wouldn't obtain an immediate answer. It was clear that although Yin Lu sensed it, she was in a state of astonishment. Just as both sides were probing, contacting, and researching, a telepathic thought suddenly interjected. It was unfamiliar beyond their imaginations, but it had the flavor of familiarity. It was like a drunken stupor and relaxation. A new person has entered the boss's territory. What's the situation right now? The sudden insertion of his will instantly picked up the obscure form and caused the power behind this layer of subtle connection to expand with a hum. The increase in energy level brought about a direct feeling, which was the change in luminosity. It was like a flash of light in a dark room. It flickered and died, but it was enough for people to see the outline of a scene that exceeded their expectations. Of course, this was on the mental plane. Whether it was Yin Lu or Snake Tongue, they were both shocked. In comparison, Yin Li's mental strength was a notch lower. Her habitually suppressed telepathic thought had a clear increase. It was as if a bomb had been set off in a relatively quiet space. Who is it? A pitiful person who works for some boss. Perhaps the other party felt that this explanation was too confusing, so she added, to put it nicely, I'm like a secretary or a maid. To put it bluntly, I'm like a leashed cat or dog. I forgot to introduce myself. I'm called Cat Eyes. When the other party frankly introduced herself, the latent power that had burst forth from the stimulation of their telepathic exchange returned to tranquility. It quickly settled down, just like a flash of light that had been polished and then extinguished. It was just that after settling down, the flickering embers naturally possessed a certain law. When Cat Eyes finished introducing herself, the result of the law's guidance had already changed from a quantitative change to a qualitative change. It had accumulated to a meaning of existence that could be sensed by the 3 female ability users of similar statuses. This was a relatively meticulous structure, and it possessed an extremely distinct sense of space. Cat Eyes, Snake Tongue, and Yin Lu resided on the mental plane. Their eyes, ears, mouth, nose, and all sorts of other senses, as well as their perception of the external material world, were separated by a layer. Only the mental plane, the law and order that gradually became clear, gradually appeared in a pattern that they could understand. The feeling of the flash of light in the dark room was far too vivid, so much so that the 3 of them still felt that this was a dusky room of unknown size. They maintained a relatively close distance between each other, similar to the type where they stood side by side. Due to the accumulation of changes in their perception, Snake Tongue and Yin Lu weren't able to react in time to Cat Eyes' self-introduction. Only after a few seconds did Yin Lu speak, Cat Eyes? Xia City's Cat Eyes? After half a year of in-depth understanding, Yin Lu naturally knew that Cat Eyes was a member of Luo Nan's circle of friends. But for them to meet under these circumstances, it seemed that their identities weren't as simple as just friends. If it was a deeper layer, was she a forbidden zone? It had to be said that Cat Eyes' attitude gave the 3 a good start in their interaction. Under her good example, and of course within Luo Nan's domain, Snake Tongue and Yin Lu had no meaning in hiding their identities. Their self-introductions naturally came. There was a certain awkwardness in this period of time. After all, their identities and positions were more or less contradictory in the public social network of the inner world. However, Cat Eyes didn't nitpick. Whether it was Yin Lu, who came from the Blood Flame Order, who was deeply involved in the Sun Jiai intermediary case, or Yin Lu, who was once her mortal enemy, Snake Tongue, who was theoretically missing or even dead, she only clicked her tongue twice. She quickly returned to a more realistic level. You guys are all in Ban City. What are you helping him do? Work. Daily life. Warm the bed? We're just listening to Mr.'s arrangements. Yin Lu appropriately followed up, allowing the idle chatter to have a relatively smooth relay. Things aren't going well now that the Divine Kingdom's canopy has opened, right? That's true. Is there any news or reaction from Xia City? There's an uproar, but we're just watching the excitement. But looking at your current situation. Cat Eyes snorted twice. Everyone says that the boss fought a battle with the Amaterasu Order on the Pacific Ocean. Now that he's overcome his calamity and broken through, he's like a flying bird and a jumping fish. But if that's the case, it doesn't seem to be the case? It's a bit complicated. Yin Li's mood was indeed quite complicated. I understand your feelings, but it's the same as before. I really don't understand what in the world is going through someone's mind. His lordship's previous arrangements were always like this. Snake Tongue joined in as well. Their telepathic communication was a bit more straightforward than usual. Yeah, it's a mess. But in the end, he's always forcefully rescuing the situation, giving people the misconception that he's unfathomable. Cat Eyes was happy to introduce her experiences to these two latecomers, even though she didn't really understand the current situation. In the past, Cat Eyes often borrowed the living starry sky, the large production line, and other similar mental domain structures to launch a long-distance mental link with Luo Nan. But those were relatively abstract mediums. It was like facing the void, crossing unexplainable dimensions. But in the current situation, it seemed that there was a solid structure that gathered the souls of the three together. It was like... Before they could make a clearer judgment, light and shadow appeared within the empty room. Moreover, it formed into a visual image that could be easily understood. The first thing that appeared was the scenery of a chaotic sky filled with clouds. They could even hear astral winds blowing past, whistling through the air. The sound and color were both present and extremely vivid. In this special stage, Cat Eyes and the other two quickly thought back to the scene from last night. Cat Eyes snorted again. What's going on? A fortress in the clouds, a falling sun, yesterday reappearing? Yinlu was probably thinking the same thing. On the other hand, Snake Tongue's thoughts had an additional layer. Perhaps this was the cloud world that had trapped her for half a year? As the thoughts of the three deviated, the image that appeared changed. In the depths of the clouds, rules and laws were vaguely visible within. As the astral winds blew, the surrounding clouds dispersed. However, there were also a few strands of yarn that were entangled with the enormous creation within. Under the interaction of the two, a silhouette was gradually revealed. Oh, it really is. The scene that appeared before the eyes of the three was clearly a fortress formed from clouds. Even though the background was a vast azure sky, it still towered majestically. Especially its connection to the surrounding clouds. It was as if a cloud that covered the horizon was fluttering and fluttering. The rules were built within, causing the clouds that filled the sky to be immersed in laws even as they unfolded and flew. It was simply like a military line that could be retracted and retracted freely. In fact, it wasn't just the outer layer. The cloud fortress that served as the base of the image was also constantly changing. Every region in the depths of the condensed, seemingly substantial clump of clouds had minute changes. This was reflected in the basic silhouette. There were also slight adjustments. After looking at it for a long time, the scale of time became a bit blurry. It was as if they were appreciating the effects of a time-lapse photography. The endless flow of time and the changes of a macroscopic perspective were compressed into a scale that they could understand. The special effects are pretty good. I can't see anything deeper than that. Cat Eye's evaluation was basically the consensus of the three. From the looks of it, the image displayed was still a certain distance from the real world. It was as if the three of them were in a movie theater, watching the image displayed on an enormous screen. If one were to lower their expectations, it could be considered more realistic. But if one were to use a harsh attitude to evaluate it, there was a barrier called reality between them and the image. The boss called us over for the sake of letting everyone watch a movie and relax. It's also possible that he's teaching us live. When considering Luo Nan's temperament, as well as the fact that they couldn't relax in Ban City, Cat Eye's second half of her judgment was quite agreeable. The three of them were all observing and pondering. The large screen in front of them was playing what seemed to be a large-scale production, but it still lacked an immersive experience. It was as if the three of them were sitting in a traditional movie theater. They interacted with each other under the dusky lighting. They could only see the blurry silhouettes of each other, but they were unable to see any further details. This sort of analogical experience made it easier for them to adapt to their current environment. It allowed their communication to become smoother. Yinlu shared her new feeling. It seems like there's something else inside the cloud fortress. Where is it? There's a bloody glow in the middle. Is there? There isn't? Yinlu was very baffled. Her current mental state was also very baffled. Her mind was naturally divided into two parts. One part was communicating with people in the movie theater that was neither real nor fake, unable to see through the bewilderment barrier. The other part was stationed in the Abyss District. It was closely connected to the structure of the Blood Soul Temple in the Abyss District, forming a transparent high-level clairvoyance. The two parts of her mind didn't conflict. They were both real and real. Gradually, she could feel the structure of the Blood Soul Temple in the Abyss District. There existed a rather rhythmic warped undulation. This caused her mind to sway, and she was quite pleasantly surprised. It was probably because this feeling was very familiar. She would come back to it from time to time in the past half-year. According to Mrs. Holder, this was someone's usual experimental method. The foundation of the Blood Flame Order was essentially nothing more than a set of experimental products for that person. As the deputy first oblatum of the order, it was actually a bit difficult for Yinlu to adapt to this rhythm. But under the current circumstances, this distortion that affected the foundation of her extraordinary strength was like a gently swaying swing. It brought her along to leisurely sway. Everything was out of her control, but it was inexplicably safe and secure. Mr. The thought appeared in the movie theater. Before it could completely take shape, Cat Eyes let out a whoa from the side. There really is one. The background of the image of the blue sky and white clouds suddenly had the color of blood spread out. Moreover, it appeared at the center of the mist fortress that Yinlu spoke of. The newly emerged elements possessed a very strong sense of space. It was as if they had entered another world through a hole in the depths of the mist. There were towering rocks and flowing bloody light. Below it was a hot lake of lava, and above it floated turbid clouds and lightning. It was malevolent and terrifying. It was similar to the demonic realm's ghost prison. Within the movie theater, one could even hear the muffled sounds of lava boiling and flowing. Yinlu's mind finally became confused. She couldn't distinguish the relationship between the structure of the Blood Soul Temple in the Clear Abyss District and the image of the Blood Soul Temple in front of her. She subconsciously muttered to herself, "The Blood Soul Temple?" Before Cat Eyes and Snake Tongue could react to this, a living creature with wings suddenly emerged from the chaotic cluster of clouds. It was accompanied by a long and hoarse cry as it charged out. Its shape was similar to a prehistoric pterosaur. It had a sharp beak, a thin neck, long wings, and a thick tail. Its entire body was featherless and covered in scales. The most astonishing thing was that these things were actually in groups. When the leader appeared, a dark mass of people followed behind, stacking upon each other. Amidst the clamorous cries, they spat out a large amount of acid. It was like a violent gale and a sudden shower of rain that rolled down. The cloud was wrapped in acid rain. Suddenly, lightning flashed and thunder roared. Amidst the crackling sounds of exploding lightning, a group of beetles resembling a black cloud appeared. It was unknown how many thousands or tens of thousands of them buzzed out. What followed was an absurd amount of meteors that were thrown down. However, halfway through, one could see that each and every one of them had their limbs bunched up. It was difficult to distinguish their stone humanoid forms as they were thrown down towards the bottomless layer of clouds. And this was just the beginning. In a few breaths of time, there were countless waves of marvelous creatures that appeared from within the cluster of clouds and lightning. Behind them, there were even man-made flying machines and large mechas rushing out. Occasionally, there would be a few illusory human figures whose faces could not be seen clearly. They either spiraled in the air, dropped down at high speeds, or attacked each other. They occupied the entire screen of the image. The three female ability users in the movie theater seemed to be watching an absurd fantasy war film. It also seemed as if they had fallen into some absurd dreamland. A more rational way of looking at it would be like someone had taken multiple shots and spliced them together into a video work. At the same time, it was presented in this large background. Not to mention the effects of the editing, just the logic of the shots was enough to make one feel despair. If one had to find a common point from this mess of images, then it would probably be this. Every image of an existence manifested an extraordinary power. Moreover, every power seemed to be rather out of the ordinary. This was especially true for the few illusory human figures that pierced out from the back. Most of them were only wrapped in a single layer of armor. Some of them even wore unlined clothing and were unarmed. Yet, every movement they made pierced through the sky and collapsed the clouds. They roared through the wind and thunder. It was as if they were gods manifesting themselves. Cough. It should be said that everyone was an extraordinary. The image of Cat Eyes in the movie theater very naturally assumed a posture of supporting her chin with her legs crossed. Your Blood Soul Temple is actually a summoning class? That's not funny. Not to mention the two conversing, Snake Tongue was watching seriously to the side. She was dizzy from watching, but at the same time, she had some strange sensations. She seemed to be able to hear some sort of noise amidst the unbearably chaotic background noise of the fantasy war film. It was extremely muffled and rather chaotic. Most importantly, she was unable to find a corresponding scene in the movie playing. She practically believed it to be a tinnitus illusion. But where did the tinnitus come from within the framework of Luo Nan's mental domain? Once the sensation was born, it was like maggots attached to the bones. It lingered and refused to disperse. Did you hear anything? Cat Eyes suddenly changed the topic. Snake Tongue could feel that the telepathic connection between the three of them still existed. Some strong thoughts would be sensed by the other two even earlier than the modified thoughts of communication. The three of them still needed some time to get used to this sort of communication method. It was easier for them to reach a common understanding, realize sharing, and even form a resonance. Correspondingly, the feeling naturally multiplied. There was no more conversation after that, but the extra noise that was like maggots attached to the bones grew clearer. Unknowingly, the thoughts of the three sunk downwards. In this bizarre movie theater, it was tantamount to listening attentively. Buzz buzz buzz. Boom boom. The noise was mixed with director Luo Nan's special visual effects. There seemed to be a certain rhythm to it. It was quite familiar. But probably because they were quite nervous, the three of them had a mental barrier. They were unable to distinguish it for a time. In the end, it was Cat Eyes who laughed in spite of herself. She eased the atmosphere. The viewing environment of this movie theater opened by the boss isn't too good. Ha! These words were like a cold blade that had been unsealed. It streaked across the hearts of the three. There's someone else? It was very normal for there to be other people in the movie theater. But the radiance on the large screen suddenly turned intense, causing the luminosity of the entire movie theater to rise by a notch. It also opened up their field of view. And so, the three of them had a momentary feeling of confusion. They were already close to getting used to the movie theater. It was a bit inappropriate. They really were in a sealed space, and they really were watching a video. But this space was much larger than the movie theater. It was like an enormous stadium. It was stuffed to the brim. The problem was that aside from the three of them, the other people were no longer silhouettes or silhouettes. Instead, they were densely packed with turbid smoke. The smoke itself didn't seem to flow, but it really did exist. And in the deepest depths of the smoke, there seemed to be gloomy flames. They were one after another, and their boundaries could not be seen. They were like swaying soulfire. Cat Eyes, Snake Tongue, and Enlu had a mental interaction once more. Their blood ran cold. Inside the movie theater. Even if it was a movie theater, it wasn't just the three of them. There were other people. There were many, many people. They existed in an even more chaotic and fuzzy form. The additional noise seemed to be the whispers and discussions of these people. In addition, there was also clatter, clatter, clatter. It was unknown when, but the fine sound of trembling chains had emerged from within the turbid mist soulfire. It rang in their ears, and it was also boundlessly far away. If one were to carefully experience it, it would seem as though the chains were probing out from the depths of their souls. One end was locked, and the other end was connected. They were connected to a boundless and enormous net of chains. Every person within the movie theater, regardless of whether they were complete or incomplete, was a tiny node in this enormous net. This. Cat Eyes clearly recalled the nightmare from a few days ago. This memory was conveniently shared with the other two, and the corresponding emotions were transmitted back. Her willpower was trembling unconsciously. The structure before her eyes was becoming more and more different from the movie theater. It was to the point that a more suitable name was given. An altar. An enormous altar. An innumerable number of believers surrounded the surroundings, attentively watching the chaotic image in the center. Or perhaps it could be called a miracle. They also offered their souls to the miracle. The power of the sacrifice transformed into invisible flames that resonated with the miracle on the altar. It provided energy and also refined the images, allowing the gaps to be mended and naturally transition until they became one. Within the space of the altar, there were millions and millions of souls. The chains connected, sacrificed, and smelted, forming a complete closed loop. This was no longer a movie. The vivid and lifelike images and inconceivable scenes were merely embroidery that floated on the outer layer of true power. As the power trembled, it seemed to exist in the form of a living being. As for what the deeper nature of this power was, just below the trembling embroidery, a ferocious shadow suddenly appeared. Although it was only half a body, one could already see the ugly appearance of a human face, an arachnid body, and 6 different colored pupils. The instant this demonic shadow appeared, the surroundings of the entire altar seemed to be burning with a layer of raging flames. The flames scorched the mind and scattered fear. It was as if all the destructive power within the chaotic image in the center was projected onto the plane of reality. But it was only as if. The malevolent demonic shadow arched its body halfway out when a foot stomped heavily on its back. A complete and familiar silhouette of a human stepped on the arachnid demonic shadow, appearing within the vision of the consciousness of the 3 clear-headed people. Luonan. The embroidery of true power trembled even more violently. It was thanks to them that the body of power, which was originally invisible and unfathomable, had vaguely transformed into an enormous cloak. It encircled Luonan's body, conforming to the marvelous rhythm of Luonan's existence as it trembled and tumbled. They could only see that Luonan was the core of the cloak, but they could not see where it extended to. Luonan created all of this. He dominated all of this. He obtained all of this. He was at the center of the cloak. He was at the center of the altar. He was at the center of the entire system. He controlled and bore the weight of all of this. Therefore, he naturally became the focal point of everything. He did not look in any direction. He was like a statue of a god worshipped in a temple, watching over everyone. Cat Eyes could feel that the other 2 had already assimilated into the scene. Although they had entered later, they were more receptive to this scene than she was. Perhaps this was how the Luonan in their hearts should be? But she thought about their first meeting a few months ago. She thought about their contact in reality and compared it to the image before her eyes. She subconsciously felt an even more intense tremble. This bit of emotional reaction was soon drowned in that damned resonance. Perhaps it was precisely because of this resonance that the rhythm of the noise that made one's scalp go numb became even more distinct. In the end, it unified into some sort of hymn. Millions and millions of people chanted in unison. Cat Eyes chanted along, but the contents of her chant were far too vague. She chanted a bit in a muddled daze. She vaguely felt that the enormous cloak was a bit closer to her. It fluttered and brushed past her face. It flooded her mind, covering her in an unknown layer. All of the distractions completely receded at this moment. Only the words of praise emerged from the bottom of her heart. They curled up like smoke as they rose unhurriedly. My heart is a prison, my heart is a furnace. My heart is a mirror, my heart is a nation. You're tuning in to the Xiaofan's Wuxia Tales YouTube channel. Don't forget to subscribe and join us on this journey to catch the most captivating stories.